In the humid lowlands of southern Mexico, a human face looks out from a block of dark volcanic stone. The face is broad, its lips are closed, its eyes seem fixed on something beyond us. A close-fitting headdress covers the top of the head, and lines carved into that headdress once carried meanings that may have been obvious to the people who stood before it. The monument is taller than a person and heavier than many modern trucks. It was made without iron tools. It was transported without horses, oxen, or any other animal capable of pulling it. And although it appears to be the portrait of a real man, no surviving text tells us his name. This is one of the colossal heads of the Olmec world. It is among the most recognizable works of ancient American art, yet almost everything the public thinks it knows about the civilization behind it requires a qualification. The people who made the head probably did not call themselves Olmec. We do not know what they called their cities, their rulers, their language, or their gods. We cannot read the few signs that may preserve their writing. We possess no Olmec chronicle, no royal list, no creation story copied by a native historian, and no account of the events that ended the power of their greatest capitals. What survives is different. There are stone faces without names, buried offerings without explanations, settlements whose buildings have dissolved back into the earth, and landscapes altered by people who lived 3,000 years ago. There are pieces of obsidian carried from distant mountains, greenstone objects placed beneath ceremonial spaces, traces of food in ancient soil, and monuments that were broken, moved, recarved, or deliberately concealed. None of these things speaks in sentences. Together, however, they preserve a history. That history begins long before a colossal head was carved. It begins with water, because the Olmec heartland was a world made by rivers. It continues with stone, because rulers turned distant rock into visible proof of their power. And it depends on legitimacy, because no monument could move unless human beings accepted, negotiated, or were compelled to participate in the system that moved it. Water, stone, and legitimacy will guide us through the rise of San Lorenzo, the brilliance of Venta, and the political transformations that followed. They will also help us replace a misleading question. Instead of asking what suddenly killed the Olmec, we will ask why particular centers of Olmec power stopped being able to hold their worlds together. The answer will not be a single invasion, eruption, flood, or rebellion. There was no one night in which an entire civilization vanished. San Lorenzo lost its preeminence centuries before Venta did. Venta later ceased to dominate, but people remained in the Gulf lowlands. Communities reorganized. New centers grew. Objects, symbols, and practices were adopted, changed, or rejected. What collapsed were political arrangements concentrated in particular places. The people outlived the capitals. To understand how that happened, we must first travel to a time before the word Olmec can reasonably be used at all. Long before 1500 BCE, Mesoamerica was already a continent of knowledge. Its inhabitants had learned the habits of plants, the movements of animals, the cycles of rain, and the character of stone. Across many generations, farmers transformed a wild grass into maize. This was not a single invention made by a solitary genius. It was a relationship maintained over centuries. People selected seeds, cultivated useful traits, carried varieties into new environments, and changed the plant while the plant changed human life. Maize would eventually become one of the foundations of Mesoamerican civilization, but it was never the only food that mattered. Beans supplied nutrients maize lacked. Squash provided flesh, seeds, and containers. Chili peppers added flavor. Wild fruits, roots, and greens remained important. In rivers and wetlands, people caught fish, turtles, and other aquatic animals. They hunted deer and smaller game. They gathered seasonally and adjusted to local opportunities. Ancient diets were not identical across every village, and the path toward settled life was neither straight nor uniform. Farming did not instantly create cities. A field does not automatically produce a king, and a surplus does not inevitably produce a state. The change occurred through thousands of decisions about residence, storage, marriage, exchange, ritual, and obligation. Families stayed longer in particular places. Houses were rebuilt. Burials and ceremonies tied communities to land. Pottery made it easier to cook, serve, store, and display food. Exchange connected people to materials unavailable nearby. Some households accumulated influence. Some ceremonies demanded more labor. Differences that may once have been temporary became inherited and institutional. By the early formative period, villages across Mesoamerica were experimenting with new forms of collective life. This matters because older accounts sometimes describe the Olmec as though they appeared from an empty landscape and taught civilization to everyone around them. Archaeology has made that picture impossible to maintain. The Gulf Coast centers were extraordinary, but their achievements emerged within a much larger world of active communities. People in the basin of Mexico, Oaxaca, Chiapas, the Pacific Coast, and other regions were developing their own social and ceremonial traditions. They traded, imitated, competed, and transformed ideas. No one region possessed all creativity. The civilization we call Olmec arose from this world, not outside it. Even the name carries a warning. Olmec is derived from a Nahuatl term used much later, commonly understood in relation to the people or inhabitants of the rubber country. Nahuatl was the language of the Aztec world and other communities living many centuries after the great Gulf Coast centers had declined. Modern scholars borrowed the term and applied it backward to the ancient creators of a distinctive artistic and archaeological tradition. The label is useful. It allows us to discuss related monuments, settlements, objects, and practices. But it can also create the illusion that all the people involved belong to one unified nation with a single government and one stable identity for more than 1,000 years. The evidence does not permit that certainty. San Lorenzo, La Venta, Tres Zapotes, Laguna de los Cerros, and the many smaller communities around them were connected. But connection is not the same as political unity. They did not necessarily obey one dynasty. Their inhabitants may have spoken more than one language. Their alliances and rivalries may have changed repeatedly. The word Olmec should therefore be treated as a map drawn by archaeology, not a passport carried by the ancient people themselves. For much of modern history, even that archaeological map did not exist. In 1862, a Mexican traveler and antiquarian named José María Melgar y Serrano encountered an enormous stone head at Hacienda Hueyapan, near Tres Zapotes in Veracruz. Local people already knew the monument. Melgar did not discover it in the sense of bringing an unknown object into existence. He introduced it to a wider scholarly conversation. He was struck by the head's appearance and speculated about distant origins. Some of his interpretations would not survive modern scrutiny. But the report placed a monumental enigma before the learned world. The head did not fit easily into the history then being constructed for ancient Mexico. The Maya were known for ruined stone cities and inscriptions. The Aztec were known through archaeology, indigenous accounts, and Spanish colonial records. The creators of the Veracruz head seemed to belong to neither familiar category. With no readable date and no accepted cultural sequence, scholars could not agree on how old it was or where it belonged. During the 20th century, excavations transformed that uncertainty. Matthew Sterling, of the Smithsonian Institution, led investigations at Tres Zapotes, La Venta, San Lorenzo, and other sites. His work, conducted with colleagues and with large numbers of local laborers, whose contributions older narratives too often compressed into the background, helped demonstrate that the monuments belonged to a civilization of unexpected antiquity. At Tres Zapotes, a carved monument known as Stela T preserved a calendrical date that became central to chronological debates. As researchers improved their understanding of Mesoamerican dating and ceramic sequences, the Olmec world moved backward in time, earlier than many had imagined. The artist and scholar Miguel Covarrubias compared visual motifs across Mesoamerica and argued for the foundational importance of Olmec art. Philip Drucker studied ceramics and architecture at La Venta. Robert Heiser and other researchers expanded investigations there. Michael Coe and Richard Deal undertook major work at San Lorenzo, while later projects led by Anne Cyphers radically refined the picture of the city, its monuments, settlements, environment, and political organization. Each generation answered questions and created new ones. Early debates often asked whether the Olmec were the mother culture of Mesoamerica. In its strongest form, this idea proposed that civilization developed first in the Gulf lowlands and spread outward, providing the essential model for later societies. The scale and early date of San Lorenzo gave that argument real force. Yet discoveries elsewhere revealed complex local histories. While analyses of pottery showed that objects in an Olmec style could be made outside the heartland, influence was undeniable. Simple one-way transmission was not. Some scholars therefore preferred the language of sister cultures, emphasizing interaction among regions. Others argued that this correction went too far and underestimated the exceptional concentration of power at San Lorenzo. The debate continues because different kinds of evidence answer different questions. A locally made pot can copy a Gulf Coast style without proving conquest. An imported object can prove movement without explaining whether it traveled as a gift, a trade good, a ritual offering, a dowry, or the possession of a migrant. Shared symbols can reflect admiration, competition, religious participation, or political submission. Similarity is evidence of connection, but not a complete explanation of that connection. This uncertainty is not a weakness in the story. It is the story. Olmec history is a reconstruction built from arguments that can be tested against material remains. A dramatic hypothesis must survive the same challenge as a modest one. What was found? Where was it found? When was it deposited? And what else could it mean? The place in which most of this evidence was preserved is the southern Gulf Coast of Mexico, especially southern Veracruz and western Tabasco. On a map, the region appears as a low plain opening toward the Gulf of Mexico. On the ground, it is a complicated world of rivers, old channels, marshes, natural levees, seasonal floods, patches of higher land, and distant volcanic uplands. Heat and humidity are not background details. They shape what people could grow, how they traveled, where they built, and what archaeology can recover. The lowlands could be astonishingly productive. Rivers and wetlands supplied fish and other animals. Floodwaters renewed certain soils, raised natural features, offered places for settlement near fields and waterways. Canoes could carry people and goods more efficiently than human porters crossing rough ground. A community that understood seasonal changes could draw resources from many ecological zones rather than depend on a single crop. But abundance was paired with instability. A river is a road that can move. Channels migrate, banks erode, sediment accumulates, and floods alter the relationship between a settlement and its fields. Land that is advantageous in one generation may become inconvenient in another. Too much water can destroy crops as surely as too little. A political center whose influence depends on access to transportation routes may suffer if those routes shift. This does not mean that a changing river automatically explains the fall of an ancient capital. Landscapes change constantly, while societies respond in many ways. Communities can dig channels, relocate fields, build on higher ground, diversify food sources, move houses, or negotiate access elsewhere. Environmental stress becomes historical catastrophe only through human institutions. Who controls labor? Who distributes stored food? Who receives protection? Who pays the cost of recovery? A flood can be natural. A famine is also political. The Olmec heartland contained another geographical contradiction. The most famous monuments were made of basalt, yet the largest centers did not sit beside an unlimited supply of suitable boulders. Much of the stone came from the Tuxtla Mountains, a volcanic region separated from places such as San Lorenzo by substantial distances and difficult terrain. The rulers of the lowlands desired the material of the uplands. Between desire and possession lay an enormous logistical problem. No surviving plan explains how the problem was solved. Archaeologists have proposed combinations of river transport, rafts, sledges, prepared paths, rollers in suitable terrain, ropes, levers, seasonal timing, and large labor crews. Some routes would have used water wherever possible because flotation reduces the burden of weight. Yet loading and unloading a massive boulder, controlling it in a current, moving it across shallow or obstructed sections, and hauling it over land would still demand expertise and coordination. The decisive resource was not stone, it was cooperation. Imagine the chain of relationships behind a single monument. Someone selected the boulder. Someone knew the route. Craftspeople understood how much material could be removed without splitting the stone. Workers produced ropes and wooden equipment that rarely survive in the wet soil. Food had to be collected for crews who were not tending their own fields while engaged in transport. Leaders or organizers coordinated timing. Ritual specialists may have defined the project's sacred purpose. Communities along the route may have provided assistance, passage, tribute, or resistance. The final head makes all these human arrangements disappear into one object. That disappearance is part of its political effect. A visitor sees a ruler made permanent in stone, not the negotiations and exhausted bodies that carried the stone. Monumentality converts collective labor into the image of individual authority. Water moved the stone. Stone displayed legitimacy. Legitimacy organized people. These three forces came together with extraordinary intensity at San Lorenzo. San Lorenzo lies in southern Veracruz, on elevated terrain, overlooking a landscape of rivers and lowlands. The place was occupied before its period of greatest power, and its rise did not occur in a single construction event. Over generations, inhabitants modified the plateau, built residences and ceremonial spaces, placed monuments, and connected the center to surrounding communities. By the height of its influence, San Lorenzo stood apart in scale from contemporary settlements in the region. The dates require care. Archaeological chronologies can differ depending on ceramic phases, radiocarbon samples, calibration, and the definition of what counts as the city's beginning or its political peak. Broadly, San Lorenzo became a major center during the second millennium BCE and reached exceptional prominence during the early formative period, especially in the centuries around 1400 or 1200 to 1000 or 900 BCE. These ranges are not proof that archaeologists have no idea when anything happened. They reflect the difference between a living settlement that changed gradually and a written coronation date that would mark a single day. Calling San Lorenzo the first city or the first state in Mesoamerica can sound precise while hiding a debate about definitions. What population size makes a settlement urban? Does a state require formal offices, taxation, territorial control, class divisions, or organized force? Material evidence does not preserve a constitution. A safer and still remarkable conclusion is that San Lorenzo was one of the earliest very large, highly organized political centers in Mesoamerica, and perhaps the most powerful of its immediate time and region. Its location offered strategic access to a broad resource zone. The elevated plateau stood above flood-prone surroundings, while nearby waterways connected communities, fields, fishing areas, and routes toward the Coatzacoalcos Basin. The city did not need to command every river militarily to benefit from its position. Its residents could monitor movement, receive goods, and coordinate activity across a dispersed population. Archaeological survey has revealed that San Lorenzo was not an isolated ceremonial island. Settlements surrounded it. Farms, hamlets, resource zones, and subsidiary communities made the central place possible. A capital is never only its monuments. It is a concentration supported by a wider social field. That field included households whose remains look very different from museum displays. A museum gallery naturally favors jade, polished stone, carved figures, and monumental sculpture. Ordinary domestic life leaves broken pottery, food debris, stone flakes, post holes, worn tools, and layers of soil. These materials are less spectacular, but they answer questions a colossal head cannot. What did people cook? Which vessel forms were common? How were houses organized? Did imported styles reach everyone, or mainly elites? How much did life in a modest community resemble life near the center? Studies of household assemblages in the San Lorenzo region have produced a valuable surprise. Certain decorated ceramics, long treated as markers of Olmec identity, can be rare in ordinary contexts within the heartland itself. An object may be archaeologically diagnostic because its style is recognizable, not because every family owned one. The visual language we call Olmec may therefore represent elite or special purpose production more strongly than the entire texture of daily life. This changes the people we imagine. The average resident did not wake each morning surrounded by jade masks and monumental thrones. A house was likely built largely from perishable materials: wood, reeds, thatch, packed earth, and fibers. Humidity, insects, rebuilding, and later land use erased much of it. Cooking generated smoke. Rain turned paths to mud. Tools broke and were repaired. Containers were used until they failed. Children learned tasks by watching older relatives. Food production followed seasons rather than royal chronologies. We must be cautious when reconstructing who performed each task. Later Mesoamerican societies and artistic representations can suggest possibilities, but they do not authorize rigid claims about Olmec gender roles. Archaeology can sometimes identify activity areas, diet, health, or burial patterns. It rarely tells us that every woman wove or every man farmed. Households divide labor by age, skill, status, circumstance, and tradition. Those arrangements can change. Even without invented names or dialogue, a day in the San Lorenzo region can be reconstructed at the level of repeated activity. Before the heat intensified, people checked traps or nets near water. Others worked in fields or gardens. Someone ground maize, a demanding task repeated so often that it could shape muscles and bones. Potters prepared clay and temper. Stoneworkers struck obsidian or other material to produce cutting edges. Fibers became cordage, mats, baskets, clothing, and the invisible equipment of transport. Meals brought households together, while also displaying differences in access to favored foods or serving vessels. Beyond the house, obligations expanded. A family might contribute food to a feast, labor to construction, materials to a craft specialist, or goods to an exchange relationship. Participation could build belonging. It could also produce inequality. The same leader who coordinated flood recovery or ceremony might claim privileged access to land, imported objects, and sacred knowledge. Generosity and domination are not opposites. Political power often combines them. Public feasts are especially useful for understanding this combination. A feast feeds people, but it also organizes them. Hosts demonstrate abundance. Guests acknowledge relationships. Rare foods or decorated vessels establish rank. Stories and rituals define collective memory. Debts can be created without being written. When archaeologists find concentrations of serving vessels, food remains, or special deposits, they can infer unusual consumption, but the emotional meaning of the event remains open. Celebration, mourning, alliance, dedication, and political recruitment can leave overlapping traces. San Lorenzo's rulers, whatever titles they used, appear to have operated at a scale far beyond household hospitality. Monumental sculpture suggests individuals or dynasties capable of commanding specialized production and labor. The plateau itself was modified. Earthen architecture created spaces that directed movement and attention. Water management features and stone channels reveal technical planning, although their exact functions and sequences continue to be studied. The city was built through repeated projects that made authority visible in the landscape. Earth is easy to underestimate because later erosion can soften its form. Ancient Mesoamerican builders created imposing platforms, mounds, plazas, and pyramidal structures from soil and clay. Such architecture does not survive like cut-stone temples, but it can require tremendous labor. Soil must be excavated, carried, placed, compacted, drained, maintained, and rebuilt. Different fills can be selected for structural behavior. Surfaces must resist rain, A monument of earth may represent more total material movement than a sculpture of stone. At San Lorenzo, reshaping the plateau did more than provide dry ground. It transformed natural elevation into political space. Approaching residents encountered an environment that looked controlled. Terraces, raised areas, routes, monuments, and carefully arranged zones. The line between engineering and ritual would have been far less rigid than a modern distinction suggests. Managing water could be practical and cosmological. Elevation could provide safety and symbolize centrality. A drain could move rainwater and participate in ideas about sacred flow. We should not imagine a modern bureaucracy from these remains. There are no surviving tax records, work schedules, or administrative seals that document the system. Yet labor on this scale required mechanisms of coordination. Authority may have traveled through kinship, ritual offices, neighborhood leaders, feasting obligations, tribute, marriage alliances, and the personal household of a ruler. Coercion may have existed, but organized work does not prove slavery. Voluntary devotion may have existed, but impressive monuments do not prove social harmony. The strongest evidence for individualized rulership is carved in basalt. San Lorenzo produced more colossal heads than any other known Olmec center. Each has a distinct face and headdress. They are not identical icons stamped from a template. Their individuality is one reason many scholars interpret them as portraits of rulers or powerful ancestors. The features do not provide names, but they imply that particular human identities mattered. The headdresses are sometimes compared with equipment, visible in later representations of ball players, though that connection is interpretive rather than certain. Designs may identify rank, lineage, office, or personal affiliation. Ears are adorned or framed. Expressions are controlled. The mouths do not smile for the viewer. These are public images of composure. To carve a head, workers did not need metal to be intelligent engineers. Hard hammerstones could remove large flakes and crush surfaces. Smaller stone tools refined form. Abrasives helped smooth areas. The process demanded an intimate understanding of fracture, grain, angle, and patience. A mistake after transport could destroy months or years of investment. Some heads may have been made from earlier throne-like monuments. If so, their biographies contain political transformation. A block that once presented a ruler seated above or emerging from a symbolic opening could later become the ruler's face. Reuse saved the labor of importing new stone, but economy alone may not explain it. Recarving could appropriate the authority of an earlier object, renew a sacred material, or erase a predecessor while preserving the substance of power. Other monuments at San Lorenzo were moved, damaged, buried, or placed in contexts that inspired dramatic theories of rebellion and conquest. Yet a broken face cannot testify about the hand that broke it. Deliberate damage may mark political overthrow. It may also be ritual termination, preparation for reuse, the defeat of a rival lineage, or a sanctioned transition between reigns. The physical act is evidence. The motive is interpretation. This distinction will become crucial when we reach San Lorenzo's decline. For now, the monuments reveal a political solution. A ruler's biological body is temporary. Stone makes his presence endure. His portrait can stand in a public place after he leaves, reminding viewers that access to distant mountains, skilled artists, food surplus, transportation networks, and coordinated labor converged in him. But the portrait also reveals a vulnerability. If authority must be continually performed through labor, ceremony, exchange, and images, then authority depends on relationships. A head can survive for millennia. The system that gave it meaning can unravel in a generation. The rulers represented by these heads are the closest the Olmec world offers to famous ancient individuals. We can see faces, but we cannot attach biographies. We do not know which man founded a dynasty, won a conflict, sponsored a feast, survived a flood, or lost the support of his followers. The temptation to invent those stories is powerful because a face invites a name. Responsible history must resist it. An anonymous ruler is not an empty character. His anonymity tells us exactly where the evidence ends. Other forms of sculpture allow us to move beyond the face of government and into the symbolic language that supported it. Large throne-like monuments show figures positioned within or before openings framed by motifs, sometimes interpreted as caves or supernatural mouths. The seated person may hold a rope connected to smaller captives or subordinate figures. In other examples, an individual appears to emerge from a niche, as though moving between the human world and an interior realm. Caves carried deep significance in many later Mesoamerican traditions. They could be associated with origins, water, mountains, ancestors, and passages into other layers of the cosmos. It is reasonable to consider those broader traditions when interpreting Olmec art, but resemblance is not a dictionary. We cannot take a Maya or Aztec story recorded many centuries later, replace its characters with Olmec figures, and call the result a translation. The monument tells us that openings, emergence, authority, and perhaps ancestry were connected. It does not preserve the words spoken before it. Animal imagery creates the same mixture of recognition and uncertainty. Jaguars, serpents, birds, crocodilian features, maze elements, and composite creatures appear in Olmec visual culture. Human bodies sometimes carry animal traits. Faces may have cleft forms, downturned mouths, or other features that scholars have grouped into named motifs. Earlier researchers occasionally treated these motifs as pieces of a fixed pantheon, assigning each a divine identity. More recent interpretation is often more cautious. A visual feature can express reign, fertility, lineage, transformation, rulership, or several meanings at once. Symbols change according to context. The jaguar illustrates the problem. It was one of the most powerful predators in the tropical Americas. Silent, muscular, active across land and water, and capable of killing animals larger than itself. It is easy to understand why jaguar qualities might become useful in art about authority. Yet not every feline mouth proves worship of one universal jaguar god, nor does every human animal figure depict literal belief in physical transformation. Images can describe costume, ancestry, metaphor, altered states, performance, or mythic beings without allowing us to choose among them. The word shaman has often been used to explain Olmec transformation scenes. It may describe ritual specialists who entered altered states and mediated with non-human forces, but when applied too broadly, it becomes a label for anything mysterious. A carved figure with unusual features is not automatically a shaman, and a hollow space is not automatically a trance vision. The interpretation is valuable only when it predicts patterns in posture, costume, context, and repeated imagery. Mirrors may have contributed to elite and ritual experience. Polished iron ore objects could produce dark reflective surfaces. Such mirrors required specialized materials and labor, and they may have been worn or used in performances. Reflection is both practical and uncanny. A person sees a face appear in stone, altered by darkness and curvature. Later, Mesoamerican cultures associated mirrors with sight, power, fire, divination, and supernatural access. For the Olmec, the exact associations remain uncertain, but the control of rare reflective material clearly carried prestige. Greenstone had a different visual power. Jadeite and other green materials could evoke vegetation, maize, water, life, permanence, and rarity. Their value was not simply a consequence of modern beauty. The stone had to be obtained through long-distance networks, selected, cut, ground, drilled, polished, exchanged, and sometimes removed permanently from circulation in offerings. Small green objects could concentrate as much social meaning as a colossal basalt head. Here, size and value move in opposite directions. Basalt made authority enormous and public. Greenstone made it portable, intimate, and capable of being hidden. A polished celt could be held in the hand, worn, deposited, or arranged with others beneath a floor. Once buried, its political effect did not vanish. The act of giving away valuable material demonstrated that leaders possessed enough to sacrifice it. Concealment could transform wealth into an obligation between humans, ancestors, places, and supernatural powers. At San Lorenzo, imported materials reveal a network extending far beyond the capital. Obsidian came from volcanic sources outside the immediate lowlands. Different sources possess distinctive chemical signatures, allowing researchers to compare artifacts with geological deposits. This does not reconstruct every trader's route, but it proves that stone crossed substantial distances. Obsidian was not merely exotic. When fractured correctly, it creates an edge sharper than most metal blades. Small pieces could cut food, plants, hides, fibers, and human flesh. The material joined ordinary utility with distant origin. A fragment in a household and a polished prestige object in an elite deposit may belong to the same exchange network while serving completely different lives. Bitumen, a naturally occurring petroleum substance, was another resource used in the Gulf region. People could apply it as an adhesive, coating, sealant, pigment, or repair material, depending on context. Its presence reminds us that ancient technology was not a ladder leading toward European metal tools. It was a set of solutions fitted to available materials. Stone, wood, fiber, resin, bone, shell, clay, and bitumen formed an effective technological world. Most of its organic components decayed, leaving stone to appear more dominant than it actually was. This preservation bias affects almost every reconstruction of Olmec life. Textiles may have expressed age, gender, rank, community, and office, but humid conditions rarely preserve them. Mats could define sleeping, working, seating, or ritual spaces. Baskets carried food and soil. Wooden tools moved earth and shaped buildings. Boats transformed rivers into transport corridors. Rope made monument movement possible. None of these materials survives as dramatically as basalt, so an archaeology based only on surviving weight would tell the wrong story. Art provides glimpses of what the soil erased. Figures wear headdresses, ear ornaments, belts, capes, loincloths, and body decoration. Some sit with controlled posture, others twist, crouch, or gesture. Hollow ceramic figures known popularly as baby face figurines, show infants or infant-like beings with fleshy bodies and distinctive heads. Examples have been found well beyond the Gulf heartland, including in the basin of Mexico. These figures became central to arguments about Olmec influence. Did Gulf Coast artisans travel? Were objects exported? Did local potters copy a prestigious style? Did shared ritual ideas spread through marriage or pilgrimage? Chemical analysis and close study of manufacturing techniques can sometimes distinguish an imported vessel from a local imitation. The broader answer is not one process, but many. Some objects moved, some makers moved, some designs were copied, some communities selected only the parts that suited their own traditions. This is why artistic influence should not be colored on a map as though it were conquered territory. A modern person can wear foreign clothing, practice an imported religion, purchase a distant luxury, and remain politically independent. Ancient communities were equally capable of separating style from submission. At the same time, prestige is never neutral. If distant elites adopted imagery associated with San Lorenzo, that adoption increased the cultural reach of the Gulf Center even without an army. One site on the Pacific side of Mesoamerica, Canton Corralito in Chiapas, demonstrates how close connections could become. Researchers have identified ceramics with strong similarities to San Lorenzo traditions, and some evidence supports the movement of actual Gulf Coast products. The site has been discussed as a possible enclave or community with migrants from the Olmec heartland. Yet even here, the word colony must be used carefully. People can relocate for trade, marriage, craft, refuge, alliance, or opportunity without becoming agents of an empire. San Lorenzo's network therefore consisted of uneven relationships. Nearby communities interacted constantly with the center. Distant regions encountered selected objects and images. Some partners may have admired its rulers. Others may have competed by mastering the same symbols. The capital's influence was real precisely because it could operate without taking the same form everywhere. Within the heartland, influence became material in the distribution of labor and goods. Elite residences or ceremonial areas received rare objects. Skilled carvers worked on commissions that required support. Feasts gathered followers. Monument projects connected villages to the center. These activities created a political economy, not simply the buying and selling of things, but the organization of production through power. Money as a standardized coin did not exist. Value moved through food, raw materials, finished objects, labor, access, obligation, and social relationships. A ruler could reward supporters with prestige goods. A household could fulfill duties by providing maize, fish, cloth, or work. A marriage could connect communities. A feast could redistribute resources while confirming hierarchy. Exchange created political bonds that were personal, ritual, and economic at the same time. The absence of coinage does not imply simplicity. In some ways, a system based on relationships is more demanding than an anonymous market. The identity of the giver matters. The timing of repayment matters. The public memory of generosity matters. A leader who fails to provide in a crisis does not merely lose purchasing power, he loses legitimacy. San Lorenzo's monumental program may have helped rulers convert unstable relationships into durable claims. A portrait says that this person deserves to be remembered. A throne says that authority occupies a particular position between the community and a sacred realm. A procession through planned space says that social order is natural because the landscape itself appears arranged around it. Ceremony made these claims visible. We cannot reconstruct an exact festival, but the architecture suggests controlled gatherings. People approached along routes, entered open spaces, faced elevated areas, and encountered monuments from designed perspectives. Music, costume, smoke, food, speech, and movement may have intensified the experience. The lack of preserved sound should not make the ancient city silent in our imagination, nor should it make ceremony peaceful by definition. Public ritual can unite and exclude at once. It distinguishes those allowed near sacred objects from those kept at a distance. It turns political decisions into ancestral or cosmic obligations. It allows hierarchy to be performed as tradition rather than announced as force. The Mesoamerican ball game may also have participated in public life. Rubber balls and ball game traditions existed early in the region, though no single culture can be credited with a securely documented moment of invention. The later name Olmec connects the Gulf lowlands with rubber in linguistic memory, but it does not prove that the inhabitants of San Lorenzo called themselves rubber people. Stone objects and artistic details have been compared with later ballplayer equipment. If high-status competitors participated, the game could combine athletic danger, ritual meaning, diplomacy, gambling, and political display. Later Mesoamerican ball games varied enormously. Some were local recreation, others appeared in ceremonies involving rulers and captives. We cannot project every later practice backward, but the enduring regional importance of the game makes early evidence significant. Rubber itself embodied transformation. Latex, drawn from plants, could be processed into an elastic material, a technological achievement unfamiliar to Europeans until much later contact with the Americas. A bouncing solid behaves almost like a living thing. In a ceremonial setting, its unpredictable motion could turn a court into a model of conflict and order. Yet the game was also physical. Bodies collided with weight and speed. Belts, pads, and headgear were equipment before they were symbols. The relationship between play and rulership helps explain why a headdress on a colossal head might resemble protective gear without reducing the ruler to a modern athlete. Participation could express disciplined strength and the ability to mediate opposition. The identification remains uncertain, and the uncertainty should remain audible in the narration. Sometimes compared with is more accurate than proves. Olmec rulers may also have used ancestry to stabilize authority. Portraits of predecessors made succession appear continuous. Buried objects could anchor memory to place. Recarving an older monument allowed a new regime to inherit or transform its material authority. But ancestry creates conflict as well as continuity. If several lineages claimed the right to lead, monuments became arguments. The individual differences among the colossal heads may preserve this political competition. Each face asserts a particular identity. Headdress designs separate one figure from another. The monuments may represent a sequence of rulers, rival lines, living leaders, dead ancestors, or some combination. Without inscriptions, order is difficult to establish. Archaeological context can reveal where a head was found, but many monuments were moved in antiquity, and modern disturbance complicates others. Movement after carving is not a footnote. It is part of the monument's life. A head could begin near a residence, appear later in a public line, be relocated to a boundary, and finally be buried or abandoned. Each change could alter its audience and meaning. When modern excavators encountered it, they discovered the last surviving position, not necessarily the original one. This idea of a monument biography is essential to the coming story of collapse. Earlier interpretations sometimes treated damaged sculptures as victims frozen at the moment San Lorenzo fell. Later study has shown that several objects experienced repeated recarving and reuse. Damage can belong to a long political life, rather than one final catastrophe. If a throne became a head before the city's decline, then broken stone is evidence of renewal as well as destruction. The city itself had a biography. It grew, was reshaped, attracted population, reorganized space, and changed before losing prominence. Calling its high point a golden age can hide stress already present within the system. Every new construction required labor. Every feast required food. Every imported stone depended on a route. Success increased the number of relationships that had to be maintained. Centralization offers enormous advantages. It concentrates specialists, information, ritual authority, stored resources, and decision-making. It can coordinate projects no village could accomplish alone. It also creates dependence. If too much prestige flows toward one center, local leaders may resent it. If rulers demand increasing labor, households may withdraw or migrate. If trade routes change, specialists lose patrons. If a flood disrupts production, a concentrated population needs organized relief. In other words, the source of San Lorenzo's strength was also a source of fragility. The capital turned networks into monuments. But networks are not stone. They can redirect themselves. Before that redirection, San Lorenzo appears to have influenced a broad region. The scale of its sculpture and construction suggests leadership, with hereditary elements and sacred claims. Some researchers describe it as an early state. Others prefer less rigid terminology because direct evidence for offices, territorial administration, or coercive institutions remains limited. The label matters less than the observable transformation. Power had become concentrated enough to reorganize land and mobilize people on a scale previously unknown in that region. What did residents receive in return? The answer cannot be reduced to oppression or belief. A powerful center may have offered security, ritual participation, marriage opportunities, access to trade, feasts, dispute mediation, flood coordination, and a shared identity. It could also extract food and labor, privilege elites, and punish resistance. Ancient people were not fooled into building civilization. They made choices within systems of need, pressure, hope, and inherited obligation. This balanced view matters because popular histories often move between two extremes. In one, rulers possess nearly magical control over obedient masses. In the other, every monument is evidence of brutal slavery. Both erase the political intelligence of ordinary people. Communities can support hierarchy because it delivers real benefits, oppose it when costs rise, and disagree internally about where that boundary lies. The first signs of political change at San Lorenzo must therefore be read at more than one level. A decrease in monumental activity concerns elite institutions. Changes in settlement concern households. Shifts in imported materials concern networks. River changes concern transportation and production. Damaged sculptures concern memory and authority. None alone tells the whole story. By around 1000 or 900 BCE, San Lorenzo no longer held the position it had occupied at its height. Older narratives sometimes imagined a violent destruction in which invaders attacked the city and smashed its monuments. Internal revolt offered another dramatic ending. Oppressed people rose against divine rulers and mutilated their stone faces. Both scenarios are possible in the abstract. Neither is securely demonstrated as a complete explanation. If conquest had destroyed the center, archaeologists might seek widespread burning, abrupt replacement of pottery and household practices, defensive works, concentrations of weapons, mass casualties, or evidence that a clearly distinct population took control. The record does not present a simple package of this kind. Absence of evidence is not proof that no violence occurred. Conflict can be archaeologically quiet. But a cinematic battle cannot be inserted merely because it would make an exciting transition. Revolt faces the same problem. Deliberately damaged monuments seem compatible with rejection of rulers, yet ritual termination can also involve breaking or burying powerful objects. Successors may erase predecessors. Carvers may remove pieces in preparation for reuse. Damage may occur at different times rather than in one coordinated event. The stone establishes intentional action in some cases. It does not identify a revolutionary crowd. Environmental change offers a third possibility. Rivers in the region shifted over time. A channel alteration could reduce access to transport, change flood patterns, or make productive land harder to reach. The capital's strategic position was valuable because it connected water, resources, and people. If that connectivity weakened, political authority would face a practical test. Yet a river cannot overthrow a ruler by itself. Communities decide whether to repair, relocate, cooperate, or leave. An elite, able to organize adaptation, may emerge stronger from crisis. One that demands sacrifice without providing solutions may lose followers. Hydrology becomes politics through legitimacy. Economic competition offers a fourth line of explanation. Other centers could attract exchange, specialists, allies, and population. Networks are not permanent arteries with San Lorenzo as their natural heart. They are choices repeatedly renewed. If communities discovered more profitable or less demanding relationships elsewhere, goods and loyalty could move together. These explanations are not mutually exclusive. A waterway changes. Transport becomes more expensive. Elites demand additional labor. Local leaders resist. Trade begins to favor alternative routes. Monumental projects slow. Rival lineages interpret difficulty as evidence that the ruling house has lost sacred favor. Families relocate. None of these events must be catastrophic alone. Together, they can form a cascade. This is an evidence-based scenario, not a recovered eyewitness account. Its value lies in connecting processes known to affect complex societies without pretending that one precise sequence has been proven. The most responsible conclusion is that San Lorenzo experienced political reorganization produced by interacting social, economic, and environmental pressures. Its old concentration of authority weakened. The region did not become empty. People continued to live in and around San Lorenzo. Monuments remained in the landscape. Skills did not vanish from human memory on the date a ceramic phase ended. Farmers still understood soil and water. Carvers still knew stone. Traders still knew roots. Families still carried stories and obligations. What changed was the ability of one center to organize those capacities around itself. This is the first great reversal in Olmec history. San Lorenzo's decline was not the end of the Olmec world. It was the end of San Lorenzo's unquestioned centrality. To the east, in the lowlands of what is now Tabasco, another place would gather stone, labor, ritual, and authority into a new arrangement. That place was La Venta. Its rise did not simply copy San Lorenzo. It created a ceremonial landscape with its own logic, buried immense wealth beneath the ground, and placed political memory into arrangements that remain among the most haunting discoveries in American archaeology. But before entering that city, we should pause at the edge of San Lorenzo's plateau and look backward. The civilization that rose here was not born from a mysterious visitor. It grew from indigenous knowledge, accumulated across generations. It did not require wheels, metal weapons, or draft animals to achieve complex engineering. It did not operate only through kings. Its foundations were households, waterways, exchange partners, farmers, fishers, craftspeople, carriers, and the invisible makers of rope, cloth, boats, baskets, food, and earthworks. The colossal heads dominate our memory because they are difficult to ignore. Yet their deepest lesson is not that ancient rulers were powerful. It is that power had to pass through thousands of hands before it could take the shape of one face. At San Lorenzo, water connected those hands, stone concealed them. Legitimacy persuaded or compelled them to work together. When those relationships changed, the face remained, but the capital could no longer make the same claim upon the world. The first Olmec capital had fallen. The Olmec story had not. The first Olmec capital had fallen. The Olmec story had not. East of San Lorenzo, across a landscape shaped by rivers and wetlands, another center gathered people, stone, and sacred authority. Today we call it La Venta. In antiquity, it occupied a natural rise on the coastal plain of what is now Tabasco, an island of relative elevation within a world vulnerable to water. Its ancient name is unknown. Its rulers are anonymous. Yet the city they constructed reveals a new experiment in making political order appear as cosmic order. La Venta was not born on the day San Lorenzo declined. Communities already lived in the region, and the site developed over time. But after San Lorenzo lost its dominant position, La Venta became the most spectacular concentration of Olmec power. Its florescence is usually placed within the middle formative period, particularly from around 900 BCE until approximately 400 BCE. These dates describe a long political life, not 5 centuries of unchanging stability. The new center inherited a world already transformed by San Lorenzo. Monumental basalt portraiture existed. Long-distance exchange connected the Gulf lowlands with distant sources of obsidian, greenstone, shell, and other materials. Rulers had learned to translate labor into sacred display. Communities across Mesoamerica recognized elements of the visual language we call Olmec. La Venta drew upon this inheritance, but it did not merely reproduce San Lorenzo on different ground. Its most striking innovation was the organization of space. The ceremonial core followed a strong north-south orientation. Plazas, platforms, mounds, monuments, and buried deposits were arranged in a planned sequence. Visitors did not encounter a random accumulation of buildings. Their movement was directed. Architecture created axes, thresholds, enclosed areas, and elevated points. The city made hierarchy spatial. At the southern part of the ceremonial zone rose a massive earthen construction, commonly called Complex C. Erosion has altered its form, and modern descriptions of it as a perfect cone or volcano can go beyond what the surviving evidence permits. What is certain is that Venta's builders raised an enormous mass of earth in a region with little exposed building stone. The result dominated the flat landscape. An earthen pyramid can disappear in plain sight. Rain cuts into it. Plants root in it. Later inhabitants reshape it. From a distance, it may resemble a natural hill, but every basket of fill had to be dug, carried, placed, and compacted. Its monumentality was measured not only in height, but in accumulated human journeys, thousands upon thousands of trips made by people carrying earth. North of this mound lay Complex A, one of the most intensively studied ceremonial areas in ancient Mesoamerica. Here, architecture and deposition created a landscape of concealment. Builders excavated pits, laid down colored clays, arranged serpentine blocks, placed greenstone objects, covered them, rebuilt surfaces, and returned in later phases. Some of the most expensive acts performed at Venta were designed to vanish beneath the feet of the living. This is a different language of power, from a colossal head exposed to public view. A head makes authority visible. A buried offering makes authority secret, permanent, and embedded in place. The audience may witness the ceremony without seeing the final arrangement. Knowledge of what lies below can be restricted to participants and transmitted through memory. The deposit becomes a relationship between rulers, community, ancestors, earth, and supernatural forces. Modern economics might describe burial as waste. Valuable material is removed from use. Ancient political economy turns that apparent waste into proof. Only people with command of extensive resources can give away objects that took months of labor and long journeys to obtain. Destruction or concealment demonstrates that wealth serves a purpose greater than ordinary exchange. Among Venta's most remarkable deposits were massive offerings involving serpentine blocks. Serpentine is a greenish stone, distinct from jadeite, but capable of carrying related visual associations. Blocks were transported to the site, arranged in pits, and buried beneath layers of colored material. Some deposits included mosaic-like pavements made from shaped stone pieces. Their designs have been interpreted in various ways, including highly stylized faces or symbolic patterns, but they were covered after placement. The act demanded extraordinary coordination. Stone had to be acquired and moved. Pits had to be excavated. Pieces had to be prepared. Participants had to follow a sequence precise enough to preserve the arrangement before it disappeared. Earth was then replaced, and surfaces restored. What remained above gave little indication of the labor and value below. Archaeologists uncover such a deposit in reverse. They remove the latest layer first, recording changes in soil color and texture. A careless excavation could destroy the very sequence needed to interpret the ceremony. Each cut, fill, floor, and intrusive pit establishes relative order. Radiocarbon samples and ceramics can help estimate time, but the meaning of the action depends heavily on context. This is why an object without provenance loses part of its voice. A greenstone celt in a collection may be beautiful, but unless its find location is known, we cannot tell whether it came from a household, burial, cache, workshop, or modern looting. At La Venta, arrangement is evidence. The distance between figures, the orientation of a celt, and the layer sealing a deposit can matter as much as the object itself. No discovery demonstrates this more powerfully than offering 4. In 1955, archaeologists working at La Venta uncovered a small group of carved figures placed beneath the ground. 16 human figures, most made from greenstone and one from a different stone, stand within a carefully staged composition. In front of them rises a row of slender celts, positioned like a symbolic wall, backdrop, or set of upright markers. One figure appears to face the others. The group feels so deliberate that viewers instinctively begin to tell a story. Is it a council, a ruler addressing followers, a lineage confronting an outsider, a diplomatic gathering, an accession ceremony, a commemoration of conflict? The arrangement invites all these readings and proves none of them. The figures do not carry captions. Their gestures are limited. Their original colors, clothing, and perishable accessories, if any, are lost. Even the apparent centrality of one individual depends on how the composition is viewed. What archaeology can state securely is that people selected valuable figures, arranged them to represent a human gathering, placed upright celts behind or before them, and buried the scene. The deposit was later reopened or revisited in antiquity, and then carefully closed again, suggesting continuing memory of its location. That return is as important as the first burial. Someone knew where the offering lay. The place remained meaningful. Reopening did not necessarily mean robbery. The arrangement was not simply stripped of value. The act may have renewed, inspected, altered, or ritually engaged an older deposit. Political memory at La Venta could be subterranean, yet active. Offering 4 gives us the nearest thing to a frozen event, but responsible narration must preserve its silence. We can describe the range of interpretations. We cannot choose one because it creates better drama. The mystery becomes more powerful when the boundary is clear. We are looking at a representation of people who mattered, arranged by people who understood the event, while both groups remain unnamed. Other deposits at La Venta included greenstone celts, arranged in patterns, figurines, polished objects, and materials brought from far beyond the local plane. Their concentration reveals the reach of the city's exchange relationships. La Venta did not sit beside every resource it consumed. Its leaders depended on routes connecting mountains, valleys, coasts, and river systems. Greenstone likely arrived through complex chains rather than one royal caravan traveling from source to capital. Miners or collectors obtained raw material. Craftspeople shaped it near a source or at intermediate settlements. Merchants, emissaries, pilgrims, marriage partners, and local leaders transferred pieces through repeated exchanges. A single object may have changed owners many times, accumulating history with each passage. The final burial erased those exchanges from sight and claimed them for La Venta. This was political compression similar to the colossal head. Many relationships became one offering. Many journeys became one ruler's capacity to give. La Venta also displayed monumental sculpture above ground. Colossal heads continued the tradition of individualized basalt portraits. Thrones or altars showed figures within niches and scenes of authority. Stelae presented standing individuals and supernatural imagery. Basalt columns and other stone elements altered architectural space. The city communicated both, through what visitors saw and what they were told lay hidden. Moving basalt to La Venta may have been even more demanding than moving it to San Lorenzo, depending on source and route. Water transport was almost certainly important, but transported by river is not a complete solution. A raft carrying many tons must float in sufficient depth, survive currents, and reach a landing. The stone then has to cross the final distance to its intended position. Seasonal floods could help by raising water levels or hurt by making control impossible. Every successful delivery reinforced political credibility. The arrival of a boulder from the Tuxtla region was itself an event. Before carving began, the stone already proved that distant people, knowledge, roots, and labor had been coordinated. Carving transformed logistical success into a human face or sacred scene. La Venta's monuments also show that political art was not static. Sculptures were placed, altered, damaged, and relocated. Some images may have been intentionally mutilated. As at San Lorenzo, motive remains difficult to recover. Political transition, ritual termination, conflict and reuse can produce similar physical results. The city's history should not be compressed into a single layer of broken stone. The population around La Venta supported this ceremonial theater through ordinary work. People farmed on suitable soils, harvested river and wetland resources, maintained houses, made pottery, wove fibers, worked stone, prepared food, and raised children. The monumental core depended on communities distributed across the wider region. A ceremonial capital without a surrounding economy is an illusion created by excavation maps. Floodplain life required constant environmental intelligence. People observed where sediment accumulated, which channels remained navigable, when fish moved, how crops responded to moisture, and where settlement surfaces needed repair. Such knowledge was often held locally rather than by rulers. Political centers depended on expertise they did not invent. This dependence complicates the image of centralized control. A ruler may order a project, but farmers decide how to meet demands while sustaining households. Boat operators know which route is safe. Craftspeople know how long production will take. Local leaders can delay, negotiate, or redirect contributions. Authority travels through layers of practical knowledge. Feasting likely helped connect those layers. Large gatherings could transform surplus into public loyalty. Food became visible generosity. Imported serving vessels or rare ingredients marked distinction. Music, costume, and performance turned redistribution into memory. Participants might leave with food, gifts, new obligations, or a stronger sense that La Venta stood at the center of a sacred region. But ceremony also exposed inequality. Some individuals occupied elevated positions, some handled rare objects, some approached restricted spaces, others carried earth and watched from a distance. Architecture organized not only movement, but access. Complex A demonstrates how restricted knowledge could endure through repeated building episodes. Floors were laid over earlier deposits. New construction respected or transformed old alignments. This suggests institutional continuity. People remembered rules about where to build and how to renew sacred space. Such continuity may have been maintained by specialist lineages, ritual offices, or ruling households. We cannot call these people priests in the exact sense of a later written religion, but ritual specialization is a reasonable inference. Someone had to know the sequence of offerings, the selection of materials, the calendar of ceremonies, and the stories attached to monuments. Knowledge could become a source of power when access to it was limited. Specialists may also have observed celestial cycles. Venta's orientation has encouraged interpretations involving astronomy, geomagnetism, cosmology, or practical planning. Alignments can be meaningful, but they are easy to overstate. A site has many lines, and some will point toward a sunrise or landscape feature by chance. Strong claims require repeated patterns, accurate measurements, chronological relevance, and evidence that the proposed target mattered to the culture. The safer conclusion is that orientation mattered. Builders repeatedly organized major spaces along a consistent axis. Whether that axis encoded a specific astronomical event, a sacred geography, political order, or several principles together remains debated. The city turned direction into authority. Color may have reinforced that order. Different clays and stones created contrasts, now muted or buried. Red, yellow, white, dark, and green materials could distinguish layers and surfaces. Ancient visitors did not see the weathered brown landscape familiar in modern photographs. Architecture may have been plastered, painted, renewed, and decorated with perishable materials. The visual world extended to human bodies. Elite figures wore elaborate headdresses, ear ornaments, pendants, belts, and capes. Body paint and temporary materials may have transformed appearances during ceremony. Portable figurines preserve hairstyles, postures, and costumes, though they cannot be treated as photographs of everyday fashion. Some Olmec figures depict infants with striking naturalism. Others show bodies that modern viewers may identify as disabled, unusual, or non-standard. Earlier interpretations sometimes turned these bodies into evidence of exotic ritual or supernatural difference. A more respectful approach begins with the possibility that ancient artists represented real human variation. Status, personhood, and sacred meaning cannot be inferred from physical difference alone. Portraiture in Olmec art is broader than the colossal heads. Small figures capture folded limbs, rounded flesh, attentive faces, and individual posture. This naturalism demonstrates an artistic interest in human presence, not simply abstract symbols. Yet even realistic images participate in social conventions. A composed face can idealize authority while still resembling a person. The artists remain anonymous. Their skill suggests apprenticeship, observation, practice, correction, and knowledge transmitted from experienced makers. Workshops may have been attached to elite households or supported for particular commissions. Some craftspeople may have traveled between centers, carrying techniques with them. Style can reveal such movement, but it does not operate like a signature. Two artists trained in the same tradition may produce similar works. A local craftsperson can imitate an imported object. A patron can demand a foreign style. Researchers therefore combine visual analysis with raw material sourcing, manufacturing traces, and excavation context. This combination has transformed the debate over Olmec objects found outside the Gulf Coast. Earlier maps often marked every Olmec-style artifact as a point of Olmec expansion. New studies ask more precise questions. Was the clay local? Was the stone imported? Does the carving follow the same sequence of cuts? Is the object found in an elite burial, household refuse, or ceremonial cache? Does the local community continue its own traditions around it? The result is a Mesoamerica full of selective adoption. At Chalcatzingo in Morelos, monumental carvings share features with Gulf Coast imagery while responding to a dramatic local landscape of cliffs and mountains. In the basin of Mexico, communities at places such as Tlatilco and Tlapacoya used figurines and ceramics related to Olmec styles within their own social worlds. In Oaxaca, Guerrero, Chiapas, and Guatemala, motifs traveled, changed, and entered local political arguments. Chalcatzingo offers a powerful example. Reliefs carved into rock depict figures associated with caves, clouds, rain, plants, or powerful beings, depending on interpretation. Their setting matters. The mountain is not a neutral surface holding imported art. It becomes part of the image. Even if artists or ideas came from the Gulf Coast, local patrons transformed them through place. This is why the phrase Olmec influence should begin a question rather than end one. Influence by whom, upon whom, through what relationship, and for whose benefit? A distant elite might adopt prestigious imagery to strengthen its own independence. Copying San Lorenzo or La Venta could acknowledge their status while creating a local rival. Political power can spread without borders, and style can travel farther than government. The Olmec horizon across Mesoamerica may reflect a prestige language used by elites who needed shared symbols for alliance and competition. It may also preserve migrations, merchant communities, ritual networks, and unequal exchange. No single model covers every site. La Venta benefited from this wider language. The more recognizable its symbols became, the more its leaders could present their capital as a place of universal significance. Distant materials arriving at the city confirmed that claim. Yet wide circulation also reduced control. Once a symbol can be reproduced elsewhere, local rulers can use it without obeying its former center. This tension between reach and control would become important in La Venta's final centuries. The city's visual world spread widely, but Mesoamerica did not become one Olmec empire. Multiple centers grew, exchange routes changed, communities developed new forms of public architecture. The prestige system that magnified La Venta also created competitors capable of speaking its language. Among the most consequential ideas moving through this world were systems for recording information. Whether the early and middle formative Gulf Coast Olmec possessed full writing has been one of the most debated questions in American archaeology. Writing is more than a picture. A picture can represent a jaguar, ruler, or event without encoding spoken language. A writing system uses conventional signs in pattern sequences to represent words, sounds, grammar, or combinations of these. To identify ancient writing, researchers examine repetition, sign order, variation, direction, and context. A few isolated marks are difficult to classify because ownership symbols, emblems, numerals, and decorative motifs can also repeat. At San Andres, a site near La Venta, excavations recovered objects bearing signs that some scholars interpret as evidence of early writing and calendrical notation. These include a small greenstone plaque and a ceramic cylinder seal or roller stamp. The context and date make them extremely important. The signs may show that elite communication extended beyond imagery into conventional records. The interpretation is not universally accepted. With a tiny sample, it is difficult to demonstrate a complete system. A sign resembling a later glyph may be ancestral to it, coincidentally similar, or part of a broader symbolic tradition. The correct narration is not that writing has been definitively translated. It is that San Andres provides strong evidence of experimentation with notation in the La Venta political sphere. An even more dramatic object is the Cascajal block, found near the Olmec heartland in Veracruz. The small serpentine slab carries dozens of incised signs arranged in rows. Some signs repeat. Their forms do not simply match known later scripts. The block has been proposed as the earliest writing in the New World, dating to the early 1st millennium BCE, or earlier, within an Olmec context. Its discovery created excitement and controversy. The block was not excavated in a controlled archaeological operation. It reportedly came from debris associated with construction or quarrying, alongside materials used to estimate its date. This find context is less secure than an object uncovered in a sealed layer. Skeptics questioned chronology, authenticity, and whether the signs form writing at all. Subsequent imaging and archaeometric work has examined the incisions, surface alteration, and manufacturing traces. The signs appear intentionally made with tools appropriate to the ancient technological setting, strengthening the case that the object is genuine. Yet authenticity does not automatically solve language. Even if the block contains writing, one text without a bilingual key or larger corpus is extraordinarily difficult to decipher. The Cascajal signs, therefore, occupy an unusual position. They may preserve an actual Olmec voice, but they cannot yet be made to speak. We can observe repeated signs and patterned placement. We cannot assign a royal name, prayer, inventory, or historical event. Any confident translation presented without a scholarly breakthrough would be fiction. The possibility of writing changes how we imagine Olmec administration and memory. Records could track tribute, genealogy, ritual dates, ownership, exchange, or sacred speech. But absence of surviving records would be expected in a humid environment if most writing used wood, bark paper, cloth, or other perishable surfaces. A stone block may be the rare survivor of a larger practice, or an exceptional experiment that never became widespread. Both remain possible. Knowledge did not require writing to be sophisticated. Oral specialists can preserve genealogies, roots, legal obligations, ritual sequences, and environmental information over generations. Knotted cords, marked objects, body performance, architecture, and arranged offerings can store memory outside phonetic text. Venta itself functioned as an archive made of space. Rebuilding in the correct place required remembered instructions. Calendrical knowledge would have organized agriculture and ceremony. People tracked rainy and dry periods, plant cycles, lunar changes, solar movement, and recurring public events. Later Mesoamerican calendars were highly developed, but assigning their completed forms to the Olmec without evidence would confuse ancestry with identity. Early signs may participate in the long development of calendrical notation. They do not prove that every later system already existed at Venta. The same caution applies to the long count, a system used in later inscriptions to record dates across long spans. A much later monument at Tres Zapotes carries an early long count date in an epi-Olmec or post-Olmec context. It shows that the Gulf region participated in the development of written time. It does not allow us to place long count dates in the mouths of San Lorenzo's rulers centuries earlier. The search for origins often encourages a misleading contest. Who invented writing first? Who invented the calendar? Who invented the ball game? Innovations usually develop through stages and interactions. A symbol becomes standardized. A notation gains additional functions. A local system is borrowed and altered. The earliest surviving object may be younger than the practice it records. Credit assigned to one civilization can obscure generations of anonymous experimentation. La Venta's importance lies not in winning every contest, it lies in the concentration of early complexity, planned ceremonial architecture, massive earthworks, monumental portraiture, long-distance materials, buried wealth, possible writing, specialized art, and political rituals capable of coordinating a broad region. Few contemporary centers combine these elements at comparable scale. This concentration created a city that seemed permanent. Its principal axis aligned architecture across generations. Old deposits anchored new construction. Rulers placed faces in stone. Greenstone disappeared beneath floors where no rival could casually reclaim it. The city converted memory into landscape, but permanence was a performance. Earthen mounds eroded and required repair. Trade relationships needed renewal. Ritual knowledge had to be transmitted. Successors had to persuade communities that inherited authority remained valid. Every offering closed one ceremony and created an expectation for the next. The richer La Venta became, the more resources its political system needed to circulate and sacrifice. The wider its influence spread, the more alternative centers learned to command similar symbols. The more sacred its alignment appeared, the more disruptive any failure of ritual, environment, or leadership could become. The buried offerings preserved order because people maintained the institutions that remembered them. If those institutions weakened, the deposits would remain intact but silent. Stone can store an arrangement. Only communities can preserve its meaning. To understand how such institutions were maintained, we must return from buried treasures to the living city. La Venta's ceremonial core is the most visible part of its archaeological identity, but ceremonies require preparation. Food must arrive before a feast. Costumes must be made before a procession. Floors must be renewed before visitors enter. Stone must be polished before it is offered. Public splendor begins in workshops, fields, kitchens, and boats. A household near La Venta lived within more than one economy. Its members produced food for themselves, exchanged with neighbors, contributed to community events, and encountered demands from elites. These activities could overlap. Maize prepared for a family meal and maize presented at a feast came from related labor but entered different social relationships. Pottery reveals those relationships in fragments. Cooking jars show heat alteration and use. Serving vessels display choices about presentation. Fine wares may circulate during special gatherings. Broken pieces discarded together help identify activity areas. Vessel size can suggest whether food was prepared for a household or a crowd, though no single pot proves a political feast. Food remains add another layer. Charred seeds, microscopic plant traces, animal bones, shells, and chemical residues can survive where complete meals do not. They show that subsistence was broad and responsive to the wetland environment. The popular image of maize monoculture is misleading. Resilience depended on multiple resources. This diversity also shaped inequality. Elites may have consumed preferred cuts, rare animals, special drinks, or food served in distinctive vessels. Yet status cannot be reconstructed from one luxury meal. A feast can temporarily provide rare foods to many people. Repeated patterns across households and contexts are more informative than an isolated deposit. Drink may have been politically important. Fermented beverages in many societies turn agricultural produce into a substance used for hospitality, ritual, negotiation, and altered experience. Evidence for exact Olmec recipes is limited, so we should not stage a named drink as fact. What matters is the broader role of shared consumption. Eating and drinking can make agreement bodily. Music had a similar ability to synchronize people. Flutes, whistles, rattles, drums made from perishable material, shells, clapping, and voices could fill plazas. Sound directs attention and unifies movement. A procession without sound is an archaeological illusion created by preservation. The city's axis may have been experienced not only through sight, but as changing echoes, rhythms, and voices. Smell also carried meaning. Cooking, wet earth, smoke, resin, flowers, human bodies, and river water formed the atmosphere of public life. Burning aromatic substances could mark transitions and conceal ordinary odors. None of this can be reconstructed with precision, but acknowledging the senses makes clear why architecture alone is incomplete. Ritual power depended on controlling sequences. When people entered, what they saw, who spoke, which object appeared, what was hidden, when food was distributed, and how the event ended. A successful ceremony made social relationships feel inevitable. A failed one could expose the labor behind the illusion. Weather was one source of failure no ruler could fully control. The Gulf lowlands offered water in abundance, but timing mattered. Heavy rain could interrupt construction, damage surfaces, spoil stored food, alter rivers, and reduce travel. Dry conditions could threaten crops or navigation. Elites who linked themselves with fertility and cosmic order faced a dangerous contradiction. They claimed privileged mediation with forces that remained uncontrollable. This does not mean ancient people abandoned rulers after one bad harvest. Religious systems are flexible. Failure can be explained through ritual error, moral violation, enemy action, or the need for greater offerings. But repeated stress increases the cost of explanation. Legitimacy survives when institutions organize convincing responses. Venta's buried deposits may represent those responses. Repeated offerings could renew the center during transitions, crises, accessions, or calendrical events. Because the associated speech is lost, we cannot determine which. The material sequence, nevertheless, shows that authority required maintenance. Succession would have been a critical moment. If rulership was hereditary, more than one relative might claim legitimacy. If councils or ritual offices participated, alliances had to be secured. A new leader inherited monuments depicting predecessors and spaces dedicated through ceremonies he had not personally performed. Recarving, relocation, and new offerings could help make inherited authority his own. This process may explain why monument biographies are politically charged. A previous ruler's image is useful because it proves continuity, and dangerous because it preserves an alternative focus of loyalty. A successor can honor, bury, alter, or break it. Each choice sends a different message, but archaeology often preserves only the final physical act. Captive imagery on some Olmec monuments suggests conflict and domination. Figures bound by ropes or positioned subordinately indicate that violence could be incorporated into public authority. Warfare, raiding, punishment, and human sacrifice are plausible parts of formative period politics, but their extent at Venta cannot be reconstructed from a few scenes. We must avoid both romantic denial and cinematic inflation. Complex societies generate conflict, and rulers often display defeated enemies. Yet an image of a captive does not prove a permanent army, a vast empire, or a specific war. Skeletal evidence, settlement destruction, defensive architecture, weapons, and regional changes must join the visual record before a detailed military narrative becomes credible. The same rule applies to sacrifice. Later Mesoamerican civilizations practiced human sacrifice in documented forms, and some early contexts may preserve related evidence. But projecting the most sensational later ceremonies backward onto every Olmec offering turns historical possibility into entertainment. Where human remains are absent or poorly preserved, we cannot populate a scene with victims simply because the mood seems dark. Venta's power was probably expressed as much through attraction as fear. Pilgrims, exchange partners, and local leaders may have come to participate in ceremonies that increased their own status. A prestigious center can grow because people wish to associate with it. Its monuments become resources for visitors who return home with stories, objects, and legitimacy. Such visitors might have encountered speakers of different languages. The linguistic identity of the Gulf Olmec remains debated. Proposals connect them with ancestors of Mixozoic languages, partly through later distributions and possible loanwords, but archaeology cannot assign language directly from pottery or sculpture. A multilingual network is entirely possible. Language contact leaves indirect traces. Words for crops, tools, ritual concepts, or titles can spread with practices. Later linguistic reconstruction may identify borrowings, but dating them precisely is difficult. Claims that one Olmec language named every major Mesoamerican institution should therefore be treated cautiously. Multilingualism would make visual symbols especially useful. A green celt, cave-like throne, or particular headdress can communicate rank across speech boundaries. Ceremony can coordinate people who do not share every word. Writing, if restricted to specialists, may have served political networks without becoming ordinary literacy. Who could read the signs at San Andres or Cascajal, assuming they constitute writing? Perhaps only a small group. Early scripts often begin in contexts of administration, ownership, ritual, or elite display. Literacy can expand power by recording information, but it can also concentrate power by making specialists necessary. If most writing occurred on perishable surfaces, scribes may have used brushes, pigments, bark, cloth, wood, or prepared skins. No surviving Olmec book confirms this. The idea is based on later Mesoamerican practices and preservation logic. It should be visualized as possibility, clearly labeled reconstruction, never as recovered footage. The distinction matters especially for AI-generated historical scenes. A photorealistic image of an Olmec scribe painting a codex may look like evidence to a viewer. The narration must explain that no such codex survives from the period. Visual realism cannot be allowed to convert inference into fact. More secure knowledge came from repeated contact with material processes. Craftspeople understood how clay changed in fire, how stone responded to abrasion, how bitumen adhered, how fibers twisted, and how pigments aged. Boat operators read currents, farmers read plants, builders read soil. Intellectual history includes these skills even when no text records them. The monumental core concentrated specialized knowledge but did not monopolize intelligence. A potter's firing judgment could be more technically precise than a ruler's ceremonial speech. A fisher's understanding of flood cycles could determine whether a household survived. Political hierarchy ranks people. It does not measure the sophistication of their knowledge. Children entered this world through participation. They learned language, gesture, work, and belief inside households. Small fingerprints in clay, miniature objects, or differences in craft skill can sometimes preserve stages of learning. Apprenticeship reproduced both technology and social identity. A child did not learn simply how to make a vessel. The child learned which forms belonged in a kitchen, feast, offering, or elite exchange. Education was therefore embedded in practice. Stories connected ancestors to places. Roots were remembered through travel. Ritual calendars were learned by repetition. Political order became normal because children experienced it before they could question it. Yet each generation also changed what it inherited. A copied motif could shift in form. A ceremony could gain a new object. A local leader could reinterpret La Venta's imagery. Tradition is not exact replication. It is controlled variation. This variation helps explain the diversity hidden beneath the Olmec label. Artistic conventions connect sites, but households maintained local cuisines, clay sources, building habits, and community histories. The Gulf heartland was not culturally uniform. La Venta's influence sat above and within that diversity, rather than erasing it. Regional diversity became more visible as other centers developed. Tres Zapotes, in the western part of the Olmec region, had a long occupation extending beyond La Venta's decline. Laguna de los Cerros and numerous smaller sites participated in shifting networks. Outside the heartland, communities expanded ceremonial architecture and local political institutions. No map can show a clean transfer of a crown from San Lorenzo to La Venta and then to Tres Zapotes. Political importance was distributed. One center could dominate monumental production, while others retained substantial populations and exchange roles. The rise of a capital does not turn every other settlement into a passive province. This distributed reality makes collapse difficult to define. If monument building stops at La Venta, but households continue nearby, has the society collapsed? If population moves to other centers, is that disappearance or adaptation? If symbols change but languages persist, what exactly ended? For rulers, collapse may mean the end of a dynasty. For specialists, it may mean loss of patronage. For a household, it may mean relocation, reduced tribute, new insecurity, or greater independence. Archaeology combines these experiences into patterns, but the word collapse can make them sound simultaneous. La Venta's final century should therefore be approached as a process. By around 400 BCE, the center ceased to function in the same dominant way. Monumental programs changed. Some sculptures were damaged. Ceremonial spaces were abandoned or transformed. Regional political energy moved elsewhere. But the evidence does not describe one final day. The city's vulnerability can be traced through the same three forces that produced its greatness. First was water. La Venta stood within an active lowland environment. Rivers and wetlands fed its population and connected its roots. Environmental change could alter both. Flooding, sedimentation, channel shifts, changing rainfall, and long-term ecological processes have all been proposed as stresses. Their effects must be demonstrated at the correct place and time, rather than assumed from the general landscape. Second was stone. Monumental and buried deposits depended on distant materials. Any disruption of routes, alliances, labor, or access would reduce the ability of rulers to perform power in familiar ways. A shortage of greenstone would not starve the population, but it could expose the weakening reach of the capital. Third was legitimacy. La Venta's leaders transformed orientation, offerings, ancestry, and ceremony into claims of centrality. Those claims needed repeated acceptance. Rival centers could offer alternative networks. Local communities could renegotiate obligations. A ruler who could no longer mobilize earth, stone, food, and specialists would appear less capable even before the ceremonial core was abandoned. These forces interacted. Environmental stress might raise the cost of transport. Higher costs might increase demands on households. Increased demands might strengthen rivals. Reduced participation might make monumental renewal impossible. The absence of renewal might be interpreted as loss of sacred favor. Each step converts a practical problem into a political one. Volcanic activity has sometimes been added to this picture. The broader Gulf region contains volcanic landscapes, and eruptions can cover fields, affect water, and force movement. Ash layers are visually dramatic, which makes volcanoes attractive in popular accounts. But a volcanic explanation is only as strong as its chronological and geographic match. An eruption centuries too early, too late, or too distant cannot be promoted to murderer because the animation looks impressive. The same caution applies to climate. The famous drought models developed for the classic Maya concern a different region and a period more than 1,000 years later. They cannot be copied onto the Olmec story. Evidence for rainfall and hydrological change must come from relevant environmental records and must align with specific changes at Olmec sites. Ecological pressure is plausible without becoming a morality tale about people destroying nature. Population growth can increase demand for wood, food, and land. Construction can alter drainage. Farming can affect soils. But humans also manage and enhance environments. The floodplain was not untouched wilderness before civilization and ruined wasteland afterward. It was a worked landscape in which adaptation and pressure occurred together. Warfare remains another possibility. Rival centers may have competed violently. Captives and damaged monuments show that domination mattered in political imagery. Yet no securely identified foreign army arrives in the record to explain everything. Material culture after La Venta does not simply become that of an invader. Internal conflict is equally plausible and equally difficult to prove. Elite factions could struggle over succession, tribute, or control of routes. Local communities could resist central demands. Monument damage could accompany such conflict. But revolution is a modern narrative shape, not an artifact type. Network reorganization may offer the broadest explanation. La Venta's power depended on being a valuable hub. Hubs decline when flows find alternatives. New centers do not need to attack the old capital. They can make it less necessary. Traders choose different partners. Specialists follow patrons. Families move toward better land or fewer obligations. Prestige shifts gradually until a center that once appeared indispensable becomes one place among many. This process is difficult to dramatize because it lacks a single villain. It is also historically powerful. Civilizations often change when relationships are redirected rather than physically destroyed. A capital can be full of monuments, and empty of command. By the end of La Venta's political dominance, its buried mosaics remained beneath the ground. Colossal heads still possessed their weight. The great mound still rose above the plain. None of these things could organize a feast, repair a water route, reward an ally, or settle a succession dispute. Material permanence could not substitute for living institutions. The people who left or reorganized did not abandon all knowledge. They carried ceramic traditions, farming skills, stories, ritual concepts, and exchange relationships into new settings. Some remained near old centers. Others joined communities whose material culture archaeologists classify differently. Cultural boundaries are drawn from changing objects. Human identities can cross them. Tres Zapotes is crucial because it refuses the story of disappearance. The site had Olmec monumental traditions and continued into the Epi-Olmec period. Later sculptures and inscriptions reveal new political and intellectual forms. One colossal head connects it with the earlier visual world. Stela C connects it with later systems of recorded time. The term Epi-Olmec means, roughly, after or upon the Olmec. It is another archaeological label, useful for describing transformation in the Gulf region after about 400 BCE. It does not mean a weakened copy waiting for a new civilization to begin. Epi-Olmec communities innovated, wrote, erected monuments, and participated in changing regional networks. Their existence changes the verdict. If La Venta's rulers lost power, but related populations created new centers, the end of the Olmec horizon was not extinction. It was political and cultural reclassification produced by real changes in settlement, art, authority, and communication. Later Mesoamerican civilizations inherited a landscape already filled with ancient places. Some Olmec monuments may have remained visible. Others were buried and forgotten. Stories could attach to ruins whose original builders were no longer remembered. The past became material available for new identities. Modern scholarship has sometimes treated later similarities as direct inheritance. Olmec jaguar becomes later god. Olmec cave becomes later creation myth. Olmec ruler becomes prototype of every king. Continuity is possible, but it must not erase the centuries of transformation in between. Ideas do not travel untouched through 1,000 years. A better model is a river. Later traditions contain water that passed through earlier landscapes, but new tributaries entered, channels divided, and the course changed. The river is continuous without being identical. La Venta belongs near the beginning of many Mesoamerican histories because it concentrated practices that remained important: monumental public space, ruler imagery, precious greenstone, offerings beneath architecture, long-distance exchange, possible writing, calendrical attention, and a cosmos expressed through landscape. It did not need to invent each practice alone to shape their development. The civilization's most interesting legacy may be political rather than iconographic. San Lorenzo and La Venta demonstrated that leaders could turn regional networks into capitals of unprecedented scale. They also demonstrated the limits of that strategy. When the network moved, the capital stone could not follow. This is why the phrase mysteriously vanished fails twice. It suggests an event the evidence does not show, and it overlooks the people who continued afterward. Mystery belongs to names, motives, and undeciphered signs. Vanishing does not. By 400 BCE, a traveler approaching La Venta may have encountered a place whose ceremonies were fewer, whose monuments carried altered meanings, or whose elite precinct no longer commanded the same region. We cannot reconstruct that traveler or the exact scene. We can identify a shift in the archaeological record, the end of one center's extraordinary concentration of power. The question for the next stage of our investigation is not which single suspect killed the Olmec. It is how water, ecology, exchange, competition, conflict, and legitimacy formed a cascade, and why different communities experienced that cascade differently. We will return to damaged monuments and ask whether they record revolt. We will follow river changes and ask when geography becomes political. We will test the appeal of invasion and volcano against the evidence they should have left. We will examine what moved to Tres Zapotes and what did not. And we will confront the central paradox of collapse. The institutions most capable of organizing complexity can also become the least capable of surviving when their networks change. Venta's rulers buried wealth to make their order permanent. They raised earth to imitate permanence. They carved faces to defeat death. For centuries, those acts succeeded. Communities remembered the arrangements beneath their feet. Distant materials arrived. Ceremonies renewed the axis of the city. Then the flow changed. Water found new paths. Stone traveled through different relationships. Legitimacy gathered around other places. The offerings remained exactly where they had been placed, but the world above them moved on. That movement did not erase Venta's achievement. On the contrary, the survival of its underground deposits allows us to see how deeply its leaders invested in continuity. Each cache was a wager that future generations would recognize the same sacred center. Each rebuilding phase was evidence that, for a time, the wager paid. Archaeology encounters the moment after memory failed. Excavators find the deposit, but not the inherited explanation. A row of celts remains aligned, while the political language that aligned it is gone. This is why the site can feel both intimate and unreachable. Human hands placed every figure. Human minds understood every gesture. The arrangement survives more completely than its meaning. That principle will guide the investigation ahead. We will not deny uncertainty, and we will not fill it with spectacle. Every proposed cause of decline must answer 4 questions. Does it occur at the right time? Does it affect the right place? Does it leave the expected material traces? Can it explain why one center weakened while other communities continued? Many theories can satisfy one question. Very few satisfy all 4. A flood can damage a settlement, but fail to explain political rivalry. Monument destruction can reveal conflict, but fail to explain changing trade. Environmental stress can reduce resilience, but fail to identify who gained power afterward. The strongest account will connect evidence across scales without pretending that complexity is confusion. San Lorenzo and Venta were not 2 chapters in a predetermined rise and fall. They were different answers to the same political challenge: how to turn a dispersed lowland population into a world centered on one place. San Lorenzo reshaped a plateau and filled it with dynastic stone. Venta aligned a ceremonial landscape and buried wealth beneath its axis. Both answers worked for centuries. Neither worked forever. The next part of the story begins when success stops reproducing itself, when a capital can still display the symbols of authority, but can no longer command the flows that made those symbols credible. The next part of the story begins when success stops reproducing itself, when a capital can still display the symbols of authority, but can no longer command the flows that made those symbols credible. By approximately 400 BCE, Venta had ceased to function as the dominant ceremonial and political center of the Olmec heartland. Its great earthen mound did not disappear. Its buried offerings remained in position. Colossal heads and stelae still occupied the landscape, although some had been damaged, moved, or abandoned. The physical city survived its political centrality. This difference is the key to understanding collapse. A civilization is not a single object that can be smashed. It is a pattern of relationships, households producing food, leaders organizing obligations, specialists receiving support, traders maintaining routes, communities accepting shared ceremonies, and institutions adapting when conditions change. When those relationships break or move, buildings can remain while the system they served is gone. Popular history prefers one killer. A volcano erupts, an army invades. A drought dries the fields. Rebels attack the palace. Each explanation provides a clear villain and a decisive ending. The Olmec evidence resists that simplicity. To investigate responsibly, every proposed cause must pass 4 tests. First, chronology. Did the event occur at the same time as the political change? Second, geography. Did it affect the correct sites and resource zones? Third, material signature. Did it leave the traces the hypothesis predicts? Fourth, explanatory reach. Can it account not only for abandonment at one capital, but also for continuity and growth elsewhere? A theory that fails one test may still identify a contributing pressure. It cannot serve as the complete verdict. The first suspect is water. Water had made Olmec power possible. The rivers of southern Veracruz and western Tabasco provided food, fertile zones, communication, and transport. They connected dispersed populations to central places. The movement of basalt and other heavy materials depended in part on navigable routes. A capital's position within this network was an economic and political advantage. But rivers are never fixed roads. They meander. Channels split, migrate, fill with sediment, and become abandoned. Floods cut new paths. Human land use can alter erosion and drainage. Over generations, a settlement may find itself farther from a useful channel or closer to destructive water. At San Lorenzo, researchers have long considered whether changing river courses weakened the center's access to transportation and productive areas. The idea is plausible because location was part of the city's success. If canoes, food, or stone could no longer reach the same points efficiently, labor costs increased. Communities situated on alternative channels gained importance. Yet the chronology of landscape change is difficult to establish at the precision political history demands. A buried channel can be dated through sediments, associated material, and environmental samples, but a river does not change on the neat boundary between 2 ceramic phases. Some transformations are gradual, others occur in a flood and then continue evolving. Even a perfectly dated channel shift would not explain every political consequence. People adapt. A route can move without destroying a society. If communities build landing points, cut channels, shift fields, or strengthen overland connections. San Lorenzo's decline becomes intelligible only when environmental change raises the cost of maintaining a centralized system that already depends on cooperation. At Venta, wetland geography created similar vulnerability. Flooding could damage crops and surfaces. Sedimentation could alter waterways. Waterlogging could make some land less productive. Conversely, Prolonged dry conditions could reduce harvests and river transport. The same environment could threaten through both excess and shortage. The evidence does not support a single flood sweeping away Venta around 400 BCE. If such a disaster destroyed the ceremonial core, we would expect a clear destruction layer, displaced architecture, rapidly deposited sediment, and an abrupt pattern consistent across the site. Venta's end appears more complex. Monument histories, changing occupation, and regional reorganization do not fit one wave. Water therefore remains in the case, but not as a lone murderer. It is better understood as a pressure that could alter the cost and geography of power. The second suspect is climate. Climate explanations have become prominent in the archaeology of many ancient civilizations. Lake sediments, cave deposits, pollen, isotopes, and other environmental records can reconstruct past moisture conditions. When a dry interval overlaps political instability, the connection can be compelling. But climate history is not interchangeable. The famous droughts associated with the classic Maya occurred more than 1,000 years after Venta's decline and affected different ecological and political systems. Copying that narrative onto the Olmec, because both lived in Mesoamerica, is not research. An Olmec climate hypothesis needs environmental records relevant to the Gulf lowlands and dates relevant to the early and middle formative periods. It must also explain variation. If drought affected a broad region, why did particular centers decline while other settlements continued? Did population move toward reliable water? Did crops change? Did trade compensate for local shortages? Climate stress is rarely a direct command for collapse. Rainfall reduction affects harvests, but storage, diversity, exchange, and political response determine human consequences. A society with multiple food sources and flexible settlement may endure. A highly centralized system may become fragile if elites continue demanding surplus during shortage. This distinction prevents environmental determinism. Ancient people were not passive objects, moved by climate. They observed, adapted, cooperated, competed, and sometimes failed. The environment shapes choices without making them inevitable. For Venta, current evidence does not justify a precise statement that one documented drought ended the city. Climatic variability may have contributed to regional stress, but it cannot carry the entire explanation. The suspect remains possible, with limited direct identification. The third suspect is volcanic activity. The Gulf region lies near volcanic landscapes, most visibly the Tuxtla Mountains. Eruptions can cover fields with ash, contaminate water, damage vegetation, interrupt routes, and force communities to relocate. Volcanic material in archaeological layers provides an apparently dramatic clue. The danger lies in assuming that every ash deposit belongs to the political ending under investigation. Tephra must be chemically identified where possible and dated. Its thickness must be mapped. A light ash fall can temporarily disrupt farming and later enrich soil. A heavy deposit can bury fields and buildings. Distance from the vent matters. An eruption that affected one part of the region might redirect population and trade without ending Olmec civilization. It could weaken a center dependent on routes through the affected area while creating opportunities elsewhere. That makes volcanism potentially important within a cascade. But the image of Venta being destroyed under a dark eruption cloud around 400 BCE exceeds the secure evidence. Unless a specific event can be matched to site layers and political chronology, the volcano should not dominate the visual explanation. Spectacle is not proof. The fourth suspect is ecological pressure, created partly by human activity. Large populations need food, fuel, building material, and space. Earthen construction requires enormous movement of soil. Cooking and craft production consume wood. Fields are cleared and maintained. Repeated cultivation can change soils. Settlement can modify drainage and vegetation. It is possible that population concentration around major Olmec centers reduced resilience. Deforestation could increase erosion. Intensive use might lower yields in particular zones. Competition for productive land could intensify political conflict. When environmental variability arrived, an already stressed system would have fewer options. Yet the evidence must distinguish pressure from adaptation. Floodplain farmers can use sediment renewal, mixed cropping, fallow cycles, gardens, and aquatic resources. Human modification can improve productivity. The idea that civilization automatically exhausts nature reflects a modern morality tale more than an archaeological law. Ecological pressure becomes persuasive when multiple records converge. Changes in pollen, erosion, plant remains, settlement density, diet, and land use features. Even then, the political question remains. Which groups controlled the best land? Who received food during shortage? Did leaders mobilize recovery or protect elite consumption? The same number of failed harvests can produce different histories under different institutions. Ecology enters collapse through inequality and decision-making. The fifth suspect is warfare or invasion. Olmec art includes captives and scenes of dominance. Monuments were deliberately damaged. Centers competed for rare materials and regional prestige. It would be naive to imagine a world without organized violence. A foreign invasion offers a particularly attractive ending because it explains broken monuments and political discontinuity at once. An enemy attacks, destroys the ruler's images, and seizes the roots. But the hypothesis predicts more than damage. Archaeologists would look for fortifications built in anticipation, weapons in unusual concentrations, trauma on human remains, burned structures, hurried abandonment, destruction layers, new settlement patterns, and abrupt changes in ceramics or domestic practices associated with incoming populations. Not every invasion leaves all these traces, especially in an earthen and perishable city. A convincing case should preserve several. At San Lorenzo and Venta, the available record does not identify a clear foreign conqueror whose material culture suddenly replaces that of local inhabitants. Monument damage alone cannot do the work. A successor from the same tradition can break a rival's image as effectively as an invader. Conflict may still have been local and repeated. Raids, captive taking, competition between centers, or fights over routes. Such violence could weaken networks without producing one final battle. Warfare remains a contributor, not a solved crime. The sixth suspect is internal revolt and crisis of legitimacy. This theory begins with a compelling image. Rulers demanded labor to move stone and build earthworks. They concentrated rare goods and buried wealth. When burdens became intolerable, ordinary people rebelled, smashed royal monuments, and abandoned the capital. The story expresses a real political possibility. Monumental systems depend on unequal obligations. Environmental or economic stress can make those obligations harder to meet. Defacing a portrait is a direct way to reject the person or institution it represents. But archaeology cannot read class identity from a hammer blow. Elite rivals also destroy images. A new dynasty can mutilate predecessors. Ritual specialists can terminate a monument's power through controlled breakage. Stone can be cut for reuse. Damage may accumulate over several episodes. A revolt hypothesis becomes stronger if monument destruction coincides with evidence of attacks on elite residences, rapid abandonment by leaders, changes benefiting non-elite communities, or a broader rejection of elite symbols. Such a pattern is difficult to establish for La Venta at the needed resolution. Internal conflict remains likely in a general sense. No political system lasts centuries without disputes over succession, tribute, access, and authority. The uncertain part is whether one revolt caused the end. The seventh suspect is less cinematic, but more comprehensive: network reorganization. San Lorenzo and La Venta were powerful because they functioned as hubs. Food, labor, stone, knowledge, ceremony, and prestige flowed toward them. Leaders transformed these flows into monuments and offerings, then used those monuments to justify future flows. The system reinforced itself. A hub does not need to be physically destroyed to fail. It becomes vulnerable when participants find alternatives. A trader chooses another route. A local leader sponsors a ceremony at home. A specialist moves to a growing center. Households settle closer to productive land. A marriage alliance redirects exchange. Each choice is small. Together, they reduce the value of the old center. This model explains why monumental decline can coexist with population continuity. The people are not gone. Their relationships have changed. It explains why regional traditions continue while one capital stops building. It also accommodates environmental pressure, conflict, and elite crisis as forces accelerating redirection. Network reorganization is not a way to avoid choosing a cause. It identifies the mechanism through which causes become political change. A river shift matters because it redirects movement. A drought matters because it changes exchange and obligation. War matters because it breaks trust and access. Legitimacy matters because it determines whether people continue participating. The most defensible verdict is therefore a cascade. Environmental variability or landscape change altered local opportunities. Maintaining long-distance flows became more expensive. Political competition offered alternatives. Elites struggled to renew authority. Communities moved, renegotiated, or withdrew. Monumental production slowed. The reduced ability to produce public works made weakness visible. Visible weakness encouraged further redirection. No single step had to be fatal. The cascade became transformative because each step amplified the next. This verdict also fits the two-stage history of Olmec centers. San Lorenzo's loss of dominance did not end the broader tradition. La Venta rose afterward. When La Venta declined, other Gulf communities continued. A total civilization-wide disaster would have to explain this temporal sequence. Network cycling explains it naturally. The word collapse should therefore be used with a named subject. San Lorenzo's political system collapsed or reorganized. La Venta's central institutions ceased to dominate. The Gulf Coast population did not collapse into non-existence. Olmec artistic conventions changed unevenly. Different statements describe different evidence. Around 400 BCE, the end of La Venta's florescence marked a turning point. The ceremonial core no longer commanded the same investment, monument erection, and offering practices changed. Some spaces were abandoned. Regional settlement patterns developed along new lines. For an elite household, this could mean loss of imported materials and followers. For a carver, it could mean fewer monumental commissions. For a farmer, it might mean reduced tribute, diminished access to feasts, new insecurity, or the decision to relocate. For a local leader, the capital's weakness could create independence. These experiences need not share the same emotional meaning. The end of a dynasty can be catastrophe for its court and relief for communities burdened by it. Archaeology records material change more clearly than emotion. The final ceremonies at Venta are unknown. We should not invent a last priest sealing a tomb while enemies approach. There may have been no recognized final ceremony. People often leave a center gradually, returning to repair some spaces while neglecting others. The last use of a plaza may have felt ordinary. Abandonment is rarely a single decision. One household leaves, another remains. A mound continues to receive offerings after nearby residences empty. Later visitors reuse stone or encounter monuments as ancient objects. The boundary between living city and ruin can last generations. This slow transformation makes the buried offerings especially poignant. Their makers intended continuity. The deposits remained physically secure long after the institutions that understood them weakened. Archaeologists eventually reopened them, but not as the ritual descendants their creators expected. Venta became silent in one language and eloquent in another. It stopped speaking through living ceremony and began speaking through stratigraphy. Its decline did not create an empty Gulf Coast. To the west, Tres Zapotes had already developed a long settlement history. Other centers, such as Laguna de los Cerros and later Cerro de las Mesas, participated in changing political worlds. Population, craft, and exchange were redistributed. Tres Zapotes stands near the Tuxtla Mountains in southern Veracruz, within a landscape different from Venta's low plain. Its location offered access to upland and lowland resources. The site was occupied for many centuries, spanning the Olmec, Epi-Olmec, and later periods. This long continuity makes it one of the clearest places to study transformation rather than disappearance. One of the earliest objects to draw modern attention to the Olmec world was the colossal head reported near Tres Zapotes by José María Melgar. The monument connects the site to the tradition of ruler portraiture. Yet Tres Zapotes did not freeze that tradition. Later monuments developed different styles and systems of representation. The political structure of Tres Zapotes may have been less concentrated than that of San Lorenzo or Venta. Monumental groups were distributed across the site rather than focused in one dominant ceremonial core. This pattern can suggest multiple elite factions or a more decentralized arrangement. Although layout alone does not reveal a constitution, decentralization may offer resilience. If authority is distributed among several groups, the failure of one does not end the entire center. Competition can create instability, but it can also prevent dependence on one dynasty and one ceremonial axis. Tres Zapotes therefore provides a possible answer to the problems of earlier capitals. Instead of making one place within the city the sole focus of legitimacy, power could be shared or contested across several precincts. The city continued, while political forms changed. The term Epi-Olmec is used for parts of the Gulf Coast tradition after the conventional end of the Olmec period, roughly from 400 BCE into the 1st centuries CE. The prefix should not be heard as an afterthought. Epi-Olmec societies developed new scripts, monuments, political forms, and regional relationships. Their most famous intellectual legacy appears on stone. Stela C from Tres Zapotes preserves part of a long count date. When reconstructed, the date corresponds to the 1st century BCE. It is later than the period named in our title, but it proves that the post-La Venta Gulf world participated in one of Mesoamerica's most consequential systems for locating events in long time. The long count records the number of days from a mythic starting point using place value units. Its logic allows a monument to specify a date across centuries, rather than identify only a recurring day in a ritual cycle. For modern viewers, it is similar to the difference between saying on a Monday and giving a complete calendar date. Stela C did not emerge from an intellectual vacuum after 400 BCE. It belongs to centuries of experimentation with signs, numbers, cycles, and political memory. Yet it should not be labeled the direct work of the earlier Olmec without qualification. The monument is evidence of continuity and innovation in a transformed society. Another Epi-Olmec monument, La Mojarra Stela I, carries a long text and dates, though it was found outside a controlled excavation context in the modern era. The script has attracted proposed decipherments, but broad agreement remains limited. It demonstrates the existence of extensive writing in the post-Olmec Gulf region, while reminding us how difficult decipherment can be with a small corpus. Writing allows rulers to do something the colossal heads could not: attach names, events, and dates to images. Yet undeciphered writing remains visually present and historically silent to us. A sign can prove that information was recorded without revealing the information. The transition from Olmec to Epi-Olmec was therefore not a descent from civilization into darkness. In at least some respects, the surviving record becomes more explicit. Dates appear, texts lengthen, new political identities emerge. This is the second great reversal in the story. The end of the archaeological Olmec horizon did not end complexity in the region. It helped produce different forms of complexity. To see why that conclusion matters, consider how archaeologists build a history of collapse from evidence that was never intended to describe one. A ceramic sequence is created by comparing vessel forms, decoration, clay, and manufacturing across layers and sites. When one group of styles becomes less common and another increases, researchers define phases. These phases organize time, but ancient inhabitants did not wake on the first day of 400 BCE and announce that the Olmec period had ended. The boundary is an analytical tool placed across gradual and uneven change. Radiocarbon dating provides another kind of time. Organic material absorbs radioactive carbon while alive. After death, the isotope decays at a measurable rate. A laboratory can estimate when a seed, piece of charcoal, or bone stopped exchanging carbon with the environment. Calibration converts the measurement into a range of calendar dates. The dated object must still be connected to the event. Charcoal from old wood may predate the construction in which it appears. A root can intrude into an earlier layer. Fill used to build a platform can contain material collected from older deposits. A date is not a magic label attached to an entire city. Collapse chronologies are therefore assembled from many samples, stratigraphic relationships, ceramics, and architectural sequences. The result may identify a century more confidently than a decade. When narration gives 400 BCE as the end of La Venta, It should be heard as a useful approximation for a transition, not the date of a final battle. Settlement survey adds geography to chronology. Researchers walk fields, examine exposed soils, map mounds, collect surface ceramics, excavate test pits, and increasingly use remote sensing. LiDAR can reveal subtle elevation beneath vegetation by measuring the return of laser pulses. In a floodplain, even small differences in height can mark old channels, terraces, platforms, and settlement surfaces. These maps reveal whether people disappear from a region or redistribute within it. A capital may show reduced occupation, while surrounding villages expand. New centers may appear along different routes. Without regional survey, abandonment at an excavated monument can be mistaken for population collapse. Pollen and plant microfossils reconstruct environments. Phytoliths, tiny silica bodies formed in plants, can survive when seeds do not. Starch grains can cling to tools. Charcoal shows burning but must be interpreted carefully. Fire can result from cooking, field clearance, accident, ritual, or natural events. Sediments record erosion and water movement. Animal remains reveal fishing, hunting, and diet, but preservation favors some species and body parts. Shell survives differently from bone. Acidic soil can erase remains. A change in the archaeological sample may reflect disposal practices rather than an actual disappearance of food. Human remains, where preserved, can record diet, disease, workload, trauma, and mobility through skeletal analysis and isotopes. But the Olmec record does not provide a complete cemetery representing every class and period. The absence of mass graves at a site does not prove peace. The absence of elite tombs at San Lorenzo does not prove there were no rulers. Every category contains uncertainty. Strength comes from convergence. If settlement declines, diets narrow, erosion increases, trade goods decrease, and elite construction stops within overlapping dates, a systemic crisis becomes more convincing. If only one indicator changes, the conclusion should remain narrow. This evidence-driven approach produces fewer spectacular certainties and a deeper history. It asks not only whether a hypothesis can happen, but whether it happened here. Water leaves a good example. Geomorphological study can identify old river courses around San Lorenzo. Archaeological materials near those courses can show when settlements used them. LiDAR can reveal terraces and relict features. Together, these data clarify how inhabitants exploited flood recession soils, fishing zones, and transportation corridors. If a channel changed, the impact depended on scale. A local shift might inconvenience one community. A regional reorganization of waterways could alter the capital's connection to many settlements. The political effect also depended on response. Leaders might mobilize channel work or negotiate access. Failure of response, not movement of water alone, would damage legitimacy. Stone provides a second evidence chain. Geologists identify basalt sources through mineral and chemical characteristics. Researchers compare monuments with potential outcrops. The likely source area establishes distance. Landscape analysis suggests possible routes. Monument size gives a lower estimate of transported weight, since the original boulder may have been larger before carving. The route remains a model rather than a recovered itinerary. Wood and rope decay. River channels move. Modern roads and fields erase ancient paths. But the combination of source and destination proves an organizational capacity. If later centers use different sources or receive fewer large monuments, the change may reflect political networks. Obsidian sourcing offers finer detail because artifacts are numerous, and source chemistry can be distinctive. Changes in the proportion of obsidian from different regions can indicate shifting exchange ties. Yet source change does not automatically mean a trade collapse. A new source may be cheaper, closer, politically favored, or connected to a different partner. Greenstone is more complicated because multiple visually similar materials circulate and finished objects may be reused for generations. A celt deposited at Venta could be much older than the offering. Its age as an object and the date of its burial are different histories. This distinction matters during political decline. Elites losing access to new imports may recycle heirlooms. A deposit containing ancient objects can express continuity during crisis. Archaeologists must study manufacturing, wear, repair, and context, rather than assume everything was made immediately before burial. Monument damage creates a third evidence chain. Researchers record impact marks, missing sections, recarved surfaces, weathering, and the relation between damage and burial. A break weathered for centuries before deposition differs from a fresh break made during burial. Recutting can identify reuse. If many monuments were damaged in similar ways during one short interval, coordinated political action becomes plausible. If their biographies vary, a single rebellion becomes less convincing. San Lorenzo's monuments often reveal long reuse, helping replace the old image of one final orgy of destruction. At Venta, damage and abandonment still signal transformation, but not a named perpetrator. The safest conclusion is that ruler images remained active political objects during changes in authority. People acted upon them because they mattered. Architecture provides a fourth chain. Construction phases show whether a center continues mobilizing labor. A decline in new monumental building can indicate reduced capacity, but maintenance is also important. A city may stop expanding while remaining stable. Conversely, hurried construction can conceal weakness if elites invest heavily to restore legitimacy. The end of major building should be compared with household occupation. If ordinary residences continue after elite construction stops, the political institution has changed before the population disappears. This distinction supports the idea of a capital's decline rather than a dead civilization. Buried offerings provide a fifth chain. Their quantity, material, and placement show ritual investment. If later deposits become smaller, use local materials, or cease altogether, rulers may have lost access or changed ideology. But different offerings can represent new religious choices rather than impoverishment. No ancient budget records the cost. Researchers infer value from source distance, manufacturing labor, rarity, and deliberate removal from circulation. A small polished object may represent more specialized effort than a large mass of local clay. When these chains are placed together, network reorganization becomes visible as a pattern rather than a convenient phrase. Routes shift, construction changes, monument biographies become unstable, settlement redistributes, new centers adopt and transform symbols. The old hub loses its ability to concentrate multiple flows at once. San Lorenzo and Venta experienced this pattern differently. San Lorenzo's plateau and regional settlement system developed in the Western Heartland. Its decline occurred around the transition from the early to middle formative period. Venta then concentrated ceremonial authority farther east and continued for centuries. This sequence rules out any single disaster confined to 1 year. It suggests that Olmec politics contained a recurring dynamic. Centers rose by concentrating networks, reached impressive scale, and then lost centrality as those networks cycled. The recurrence does not prove identical causes. San Lorenzo may have been more vulnerable to a particular river change. Venta may have faced different regional competitors. Political institutions and environmental contexts differed. The common mechanism is dependence on renewed participation. The pattern resembles a marketplace only in part. People did not simply choose the best price. Sacred obligations, ancestry, kinship, marriage, coercion, and identity shaped participation. Leaving a capital's network might mean abandoning a lineage temple, breaking a marriage alliance, or rejecting a ruler's cosmological claims. Change could be emotionally and morally costly. This cost explains why failing institutions can persist. People may continue contributing because alternatives are uncertain, because obligations feel sacred, or because elite punishment is real. Collapse can be delayed until several pressures make withdrawal possible. Once withdrawal begins, feedback accelerates it. Fewer contributions reduce the quality of feasts. Smaller feasts weaken alliances. Weaker alliances reduce trade. Reduced trade limits prestige gifts. Without gifts, local leaders gain less from supporting the center. Their withdrawal further reduces contributions. The same feedback applies to specialists. Monument carvers need patrons who can feed and equip them. If commissions shrink, they may produce smaller objects, serve local leaders, or relocate. The capital then loses the visible quality that once distinguished it, making rival centers more attractive. Ritual specialists face a similar choice. Their authority depends on a community recognizing the efficacy of ceremonies. They can adapt old rituals, transfer sacred objects, or affiliate with new patrons. Religion does not necessarily collapse with a political center. It can help translate traditions into a new order. Households make decisions under more immediate pressures. A family evaluates soil, food, safety, kin, and obligations. Moving carries risk, especially when houses, fields, and ancestors tie people to place. But migration can occur gradually through marriage and seasonal residence before becoming permanent. Archaeology may record this as a new cluster of pottery at another site. Behind the cluster are human decisions invisible as names. The redistribution of population after Venta likely followed multiple paths. Some people remained in the local region. Some joined established centers. Some created smaller communities. Some moved through exchange and kinship networks already used for generations. There was no single migration of the Olmec people. The concept of ethnicity further complicates the story. Archaeological cultures are defined through recurring material patterns. Ethnic identity is lived through language, ancestry, practice, memory, and social boundaries. The two can overlap without being identical. A household can adopt a new ceramic style while maintaining language and ancestry. Migrants can preserve identity while using local pottery. Intermarriage can create people belonging to more than one tradition. Therefore, the disappearance of Olmec-style objects after 400 BCE does not demonstrate the disappearance of an ethnic population, nor can we name that population with certainty. Mixed Zokian language ancestry remains a major proposal. but direct linguistic records from the Olmec period do not survive. Later distributions and loanwords provide clues, not an ancient census. What continues most clearly is regional occupation and selected cultural practice. Gulf Coast communities remain. Monument traditions develop into epi-Olmec forms. Writing becomes more visible. Calendrical recording expands. Political centers reorganize. Tres Zapotes captures this process because its occupation crosses the conventional boundary. Excavation and survey reveal multiple monumental groups spread across a broad area. Such distribution contrasts with Venta's strong central axis. One interpretation is factional governance. Several powerful groups may have maintained separate ceremonial precincts, cooperating and competing without allowing one household to monopolize the city. This arrangement could be a political adaptation to the failures of highly centralized capitals. The interpretation must remain cautious. Multiple groups can develop sequentially rather than simultaneously. Topography can influence placement. Later construction can obscure an earlier center. Still, the layout makes simple dynastic centralization less obvious. If power was factional, monument erection may have served negotiation among groups. A stela could record the achievement of one leader while acknowledging a shared calendrical system. Writing could become especially useful where authority needed explicit claims rather than relying on one sacred axis. The Epi-Olmec script appears on a limited number of monuments and objects. Scholars sometimes call it Isthmian. Its signs differ from Maya writing and from the proposed Cascajal system. Some researchers have offered phonetic decipherments, but these have not achieved universal acceptance. Decipherment requires repeated sign sequences, predictable grammatical patterns, and links to a plausible language. A proposed reading must work on texts beyond the example used to create it. With a small corpus, many readings can appear convincing because there are too few independent tests. This does not diminish the accomplishment of the writers. La Mohara Stela 1 contains a long inscription organized around a ruler-like figure and dates. Tuxtla statuette carries another text. Together, they show specialists recording political and ritual information in the isthmus centuries after La Venta. The Gulf Coast had not lost intellectual sophistication. It had entered a phase whose surviving media allow us to see different parts of it. Long count dates also transform political memory. A ruler depicted on a monument can attach an event to a unique point in time. The date can outlive living witnesses. Authority no longer depends only on oral genealogy or spatial memory. It gains numerical permanence. The irony is that modern readers can often calculate the date while remaining unable to read the accompanying event. Time speaks more clearly than language. Stela C at Tres Zapotes became important to 20th century scholars for this reason. Its date helped establish the antiquity of Gulf Coast civilization and challenged chronologies that placed the Olmec after the Maya. A broken stone changed modern history because its numbers could be compared across Mesoamerican systems. The monument also illustrates how discovery is shaped by preservation. Only part of the stela was initially known. Another fragment was later identified. Rejoining information can transform a reading. Archaeology advances not only through spectacular excavation, but through storage, reanalysis, and comparison. Modern dating debates created their own famous figures. Matthew Stirling's fieldwork brought extensive attention to Gulf sites. Miguel Covarrubias argued from visual sequences. Alfonso Caso supported the early placement of Olmec culture in major scholarly debates. Scholars disagreed sharply because the stakes involved the origin of Mesoamerican civilization. The 1942 Tuxtla-Gutierrez Roundtable became a landmark in establishing Olmec antiquity. Archaeologists and art historians debated whether the style represented an early culture or a later one influenced by the Maya. Evidence gradually supported the early chronology. This was a genuine revolution in knowledge, but it later encouraged an overly simple mother culture model. Once the Olmec became early, it was tempting to make them the inventors of everything. Chronological priority in one form does not prove exclusive invention of an entire tradition. Modern Olmec archaeology therefore passed through two corrections. The first recognized that the Gulf civilization was far older and more complex than previously accepted. The second recognized that contemporary regions were not passive recipients. Both corrections should remain in the documentary. Removing the first minimizes Olmec achievement. Removing the second minimizes everyone else. The archaeological careers behind these discoveries also require context. Early projects often depended on local workers who cleared vegetation, recognized soil changes, moved earth, and shared knowledge of the landscape. Publications commonly centered foreign or nationally prominent directors, leaving many contributors unnamed. Oil development around Venta dramatically affected the modern landscape. Industrial expansion brought access and destruction. Monumental sculptures were moved for protection and display. Some now stand in the Parque Museo La Venta in Villahermosa, separated from original context, but preserved from threats at the site. Moving a monument in modern times repeats an ancient act under different authority. Archaeologists and officials decide what to remove, where to display it, and which story accompanies it. The object gains protection and public visibility while losing spatial relationships. Museums can partly restore context through maps, reconstructions, and labels. They can also freeze the Olmec as an art style detached from households and landscapes. A row of masterpieces may reproduce the ruler's own political success. Once again, many laboring lives disappear behind elite stone. The history of collapse should correct that imbalance. When we ask what happened after La Venta, ordinary continuity becomes central. Farmers did not need a colossal head to remember when to plant. Potters could change patrons. Boat operators could serve new routes. Families could carry ritual practices into different settlements. The end of elite monumental production can make a period look poorer to archaeologists because fewer durable prestige objects enter the record. Social life may remain complex while becoming less visible in stone. This is another reason not to equate political decentralization with cultural decline. Smaller centers can support innovation. Distributed power can broaden participation. Networks can become more resilient when they no longer depend on one hub. They can also become more violent. Factional competition may intensify. Local elites may demand their own monuments and tribute. There is no universal progress, from centralization to freedom. The Epi-Olmec world was a historical transformation, with winners and losers, not a recovery scene after disaster. Some lineages rose as La Venta declined. Some sacred places gained followers. New scripts gave selected leaders a more explicit public voice. Other communities remained archaeologically quiet. Beyond the Gulf Coast, changes were occurring across Mesoamerica. In Oaxaca, Monte Alban developed as a major hilltop center. In the Maya lowlands, communities expanded ceremonial complexes and political networks. Central Mexican societies followed their own trajectories. The centuries after 400 BCE were not a pause between the Olmec and later greatness. How much did these societies inherit from Olmec traditions? The answer varies by practice. Shared elements of rulership, greenstone value, cave symbolism, monumental space, calendrical systems, and the ball game have deep formative histories. Some passed through Gulf networks, others developed through wider interaction or independent elaboration. The metaphor of a mother culture implies a single parent and dependent children. Mesoamerican history looks more like an extended family whose members exchange, argue, intermarry, borrow, and claim ancestry. The Olmec were among the earliest powerful members, not the only source of life. This balanced conclusion does not weaken their legacy. San Lorenzo and Venta demonstrated possibilities that later rulers could not ignore. A landscape could be engineered into sacred centrality. A human face could embody regional labor. Imported stone could become political currency. Time, ancestry, and cosmos could be organized around a center. Their collapse demonstrated a second set of possibilities. Sacred capitals could lose followers. Monumental stone could be recarved. Networks could outgrow the hubs that once concentrated them. People could preserve practices while abandoning institutions. The end of Venta, therefore, belongs not only to the history of failure, but to the history of adaptation. Imagine the regional map as lights rather than borders. During San Lorenzo's height, one light burns intensely, while many others remain visible. As it dims, Venta brightens. Near 400 BCE, Venta fades, while Tres Zapotes and other centers continue. At no point does the entire map go dark. This visual model is closer to the evidence than an empire painted one color and then erased. It also changes how we speak about descendants. No modern community can be simplistically labeled unchanged Olmec after 3,000 years. Languages, populations, and identities transformed repeatedly. At the same time, modern indigenous peoples of the Gulf region belong to landscapes with deep histories, and their presence contradicts fantasies of an empty civilization replaced from outside. Archaeology should not use ancient uncertainty to erase modern people, nor should it assign a direct identity without evidence. Respect lies in acknowledging both continuity and change. The final verdict on Olmec collapse can now be stated precisely. There is evidence of major political decline at San Lorenzo around the end of its early formative dominance. There is evidence that Venta later became a leading center and ceased to hold that role around 400 BCE. There is evidence of monument damage, changing construction, settlement reorganization, and shifting regional networks. There are plausible environmental pressures. There is no secure evidence for one civilization-wide extermination event. The most likely explanation is multi-causal regional cycling. Environmental and hydrological changes affected resources and routes. Political competition offered alternatives. Internal struggles weakened legitimacy. Exchange networks shifted. Communities redistributed participation. These processes interacted until highly centralized institutions could no longer reproduce their authority. The result was collapse for capitals and transformation for society. That wording matters. It preserves the reality of loss. Rulers lost power. Ceremonial programs ended. Specialists and households faced disruption. Places filled with memory became ruins. But it also preserves agency and survival. People adapted rather than vanishing. When Stella C received its date centuries later, a Gulf Coast sculptor carved time into stone in a world that had already lived beyond La Venta. The monument did not resurrect the Olmec. It showed that the region had never stopped making history. The last 20,000 characters of our story will follow that history into the modern world. We will examine what later societies remembered or reinvented, how archaeologists recovered the Olmec, how pseudo-history misused their faces, and what the civilization means when its own name remains unknown. Before leaving the ancient period, however, one image should remain. Beneath La Venta, offering 4, waits in darkness. Its small figures still face one another. Above them, rulers rose and fell, rivers altered course, styles changed, new scripts appeared. Centuries passed before anyone exposed the arrangement again. The offering did not fail because its meaning was lost. It succeeded at a task its makers may never have imagined, preserving the fact that a meaningful event occurred even after every participant's name disappeared. That is the boundary of Olmec history. We know the event mattered. We know people chose costly materials and exact positions. We know later hands remembered the place. We do not know what was said. The silence is not empty. It is evidence shaped like a question. That question also protects the story from false certainty. When evidence is incomplete, 2 bad responses become tempting. The first is to declare that nothing can be known. The second is to invent whatever completes the picture. Archaeology occupies the more difficult space between them. It constructs explanations strong enough to be tested and modest enough to change. At San Lorenzo, water placed a community at a strategic junction. Stone demonstrated that the junction could command distant labor. Legitimacy transformed repeated cooperation into dynastic portraiture. When roots and relationships shifted, stone remained, but mobilization weakened. At La Venta, elevation within the wetland supported a sacred axis. Stone and earth embedded far-reaching exchange beneath that axis. Legitimacy depended on renewing deposits, monuments, and ceremonies across generations. When alternative centers captured people and flows, the axis remained geometrically straight, while political connections bent away from it. At Tres Zapotes, the pattern changed. Power appears more spatially distributed. Monumental tradition continued, but writing and calendrical dates made claims more explicit. The center did not simply inherit a crown. It reorganized the means by which political memory became durable. These contrasts prevent the narrative from becoming a generic cycle in which every civilization rises, flourishes, and mysteriously falls. The Olmec sequence has its own mechanism. Capitals competed to concentrate a riverine network while materializing authority in stone. Their history cannot be reproduced by replacing the word Olmec with Egypt, Rome, or Maya. An institution fails when it can no longer convert resources into shared value. Monumental building can create identity, employment, sacred order, and infrastructure. It becomes fragile when the display consumes labor, without addressing the conditions households face. The archaeological record cannot tell us the moment that balance changed, but the disappearance of large projects shows that it did. This insight gives ordinary people a historical role, even when their names are absent. They were not background figures waiting for rulers to act. Their production, movement, belief, negotiation, and withdrawal determined what capitals could become. Collapse occurred through their lives, as much as through elite decisions. The colossal heads make this argument visible in reverse. Each head turns a collective achievement into one individual. Our reconstruction reverses the conversion. Behind the portrait, we restore carriers, carvers, cooks, farmers, rope makers, boat operators, organizers, and communities along the route. By the time the Olmec archaeological horizon ended, that dependence had generated traditions far larger than any one dynasty. Techniques, symbols, roots, and political lessons circulated beyond the capitals. Later, people could choose from them without preserving the system that first concentrated them. This is why legacy does not require an unbroken institution. A civilization can influence the future through fragments, a valued material, a spatial plan, an image of authority, a method of counting time, a remembered sacred place. Each fragment enters a new context and becomes something else. The fourth and final part will follow those fragments. It will separate genuine continuities from claims added by modern imagination. It will return to the archaeologists whose debates created the Olmec as a historical category, and it will return one last time to the stone face with which we began, not to give him a fictional name, but to understand why his anonymity is the most honest ending this history can offer. The Olmec capitals lost their power, but fragments of their world continued to travel through time. Some fragments were material. Greenstone remained one of the most valued substances in Mesoamerica. Monumental sculpture continued to turn rulers and sacred events into public memory. Offerings beneath buildings continued to connect architecture with unseen obligations. Ball games, calendrical systems, cave imagery, maze symbolism, and layered visions of the cosmos appeared in many later societies. Other fragments were political. Later rulers also used distant materials to demonstrate reach. They organized plazas as stages, tied ancestry to authority, and made public construction an argument about the order of the world. These similarities do not mean that every later institution was copied directly from an Olmec original. They show that Mesoamerican societies inherited a field of possibilities shaped during the formative period. Inheritance is selective. A community receives practices, objects, stories, and landscapes, then chooses what to preserve or transform. A symbol associated with one ruler can become the emblem of another god. A sacred opening can enter a new creation story. A counting system can absorb new units and signs. Continuity is real without being exact. This makes the Olmec legacy difficult to measure. If we demand an unchanged object, we miss transformation. If we treat every resemblance as proof of direct descent, we erase the creativity of later people. The strongest claim lies between these extremes. The Gulf Coast Olmec were early and unusually influential participants in networks from which later Mesoamerican civilizations developed. They were not the solitary parents of the Maya, Zapotec, Teotihuacan, or Aztec. Those societies emerged from their own regions and histories. They inherited from many ancestors, exchanged with contemporaries, and invented new forms. The Olmec contribution was foundational in some areas, indirect in others, and impossible to isolate in many more. The mother culture debate survives because it asks a question larger than one style of pottery. How does civilization spread? Does one center innovate while others imitate, or do multiple regions develop through interaction? The Olmec evidence suggests both concentration and exchange. San Lorenzo achieved an extraordinary scale early. Distant communities were already capable of selecting, modifying, and resisting what came from the Gulf. The debate should not end with a slogan. Mother culture can exaggerate one-way influence. Sister cultures can understate the exceptional power of early Gulf centers. History is not improved by replacing one simplification with another. The monuments themselves continued to have lives after the institutions that made them ended. Some remained visible, some were buried, some were found, moved, recarved, or reused by later inhabitants. A colossal head may have become an ancient object long before it became an archaeological object. Later communities encountering such a face did not possess modern chronology. They may have associated it with ancestors, giants, earlier rulers, sacred beings, or local stories now lost. Ruins generate interpretation. The past is never simply forgotten. It is repeatedly imagined from what remains. The modern world began its own reinvention when scholars encountered Olmec monuments in the 19th century. José María Melgar y Serrano's report of the Tres Zapotes head brought the object into print. His speculation about its appearance reflected the racial theories and limited archaeological knowledge of his era. The monument entered modern history, already wrapped in argument. Early explorers and scholars lacked reliable dates. Without radiocarbon dating or developed ceramic chronologies, style and inscription had to carry enormous weight. Some placed Olmec works after the Maya. Others recognized features that appeared ancestral to later Mesoamerican art. Matthew Stirling's expeditions during the 1930s and 1940s changed the scale of investigation. At Tres Zapotes, La Venta, San Lorenzo, Cerro de las Mesas, and other sites, fieldwork documented monuments within regional contexts. Stirling became a central public figure in the rediscovery of the Olmec, though the work depended on colleagues, Mexican institutions, guides, laborers, and local communities. Archaeological fame often follows the name printed on a report, rather than every person who produced the evidence. Workers recognized changes in soil, cleared enormous areas, moved equipment, found fragments, and understood local terrain. Their contributions were essential, even when older publications did not preserve individual names. At La Venta, Philip Drucker studied ceramics and architecture. Later work with Robert Heiser and Robert Squire expanded the record of Complex A and its offerings. The excavations revealed that the site's greatest statements were hidden underground, changing the understanding of Olmec ceremonial practice. Miguel Covarrubias approached the problem through an artist's eye. He compared motifs and proposed developmental relationships between Olmec forms and later deities. Some specific sequences have been revised, but his ability to recognize visual structure helped establish the Olmec as a foundational tradition. In 1942, scholars meeting at Tuxtla Gutierrez debated the place of the Olmec in Mesoamerican chronology. Alfonso Caso and others supported an early position. The debate was not merely academic classification. If the monuments were early, many accepted narratives of American civilization had to be rewritten. Later radiocarbon dates and stratigraphic studies confirmed the great antiquity of Gulf Coast centers. San Lorenzo emerged as a major capital centuries before La Venta's peak. The Olmec moved from mysterious offshoot to one of the earliest complex civilizations of Mesoamerica. Michael Coe and Richard Deal's investigations at San Lorenzo produced influential reconstructions of the city and its environment. Their work emphasized monument damage and raised explanations involving conflict and political collapse. As archaeology advanced, some interpretations changed. Richard Deal later stressed that recarving and reuse complicated the idea of one final destruction. And Cyphers led extensive research that transformed the modern picture of San Lorenzo. Regional survey, excavation, monument study, and environmental analysis revealed the scale of settlement and the long history of landscape modification. The capital became more than a collection of heads. It became a populated region whose politics depended on subsistence, water, and surrounding communities. This progression demonstrates how science should work. Revision is not failure. A theory based on available evidence becomes more precise when new data appear. The monument does not change. The questions asked of it do. New technologies continue that process. Chemical sourcing links stone and obsidian to geological origins. Microscopic wear reveals manufacturing and use. Digital imaging makes faint incisions visible. LiDAR maps subtle landforms beneath vegetation. Isotope analysis reconstructs diet and mobility. Databases allow fragments stored in different museums to be compared. Technology does not remove interpretation. A chemical signature can identify a source, but not the social relationship that moved the object. LiDAR can show a mound, but not name its builder. Imaging can confirm that a line was carved, but not translate it. Better instruments produce stronger evidence and more focused uncertainty. The Cascajal block embodies this frontier. Its repeated signs may constitute the earliest known writing in the Americas. Studies of its surface and incisions support ancient manufacture. Its uncontrolled discovery context continues to limit certainty about date and association. Its text remains unread. If another secure inscription is found, repeated sequences may provide a path toward understanding. If the signs remain unique, the block may preserve a system whose language is permanently inaccessible. Both outcomes would be historically meaningful. The search for an answer must also protect sites from destruction. The Gulf lowlands are living and industrial landscapes. Agriculture, construction, oil development, erosion, looting, and climate change threaten archaeological deposits. A mound of earth can be leveled before anyone recognizes that it contains centuries of architecture. Venta was profoundly affected by 20th century petroleum development. Roads and industry altered the region. Monumental sculptures were moved, some to the Park Museum in Villahermosa. Removal protected important objects while separating them from ancient locations. Preservation always involves choices. Leaving a monument outdoors maintains landscape context, but exposes it to weather and vandalism. Moving it protects the stone, but changes the experience. A replica can preserve placement while the original enters controlled storage. No solution restores the ancient city. Looting creates a different damage. A stolen figurine may survive physically and acquire a high market price, but the whole it came from destroys relationships among object, layer, building, and associated material. The collector receives an image. History loses a sentence. Objects without provenance also invite sensational claims because context can no longer restrain interpretation. A figure said to come from an unknown cave can be assigned any story. Responsible museums and researchers distinguish secure excavation from uncertain acquisition. Modern fascination with the Olmec has generated myths as persistent as scholarship. The most famous claims that the colossal heads depict African founders who crossed the Atlantic. Other versions add Egyptians, Phoenicians, Chinese voyagers, survivors of Atlantis, or extraterrestrials. These theories begin by treating indigenous achievement as a problem requiring an outsider. Monumental stone, writing, mathematics, or realistic art is declared too advanced to have developed locally. The conclusion is then presented as open-minded, even though it ignores the archaeological evidence of gradual regional development. The colossal heads do not prove African colonization. Human facial features vary widely, and resemblance judged from a sculpture cannot establish population origin. A transatlantic founding population should leave a converging package: securely dated foreign materials, ships or maritime technology, transferred domestic plants or animals, settlements with foreign practices, genetic evidence, and a chronological route. That package is absent. What the record does show is local continuity. Early villages precede the capitals. Regional materials and foods support their growth. Stone sources and roots lie within Mesoamerica. Artistic forms develop within formative traditions. Olmec civilization does not appear suddenly with imported households. Rejecting pseudo-history does not require claiming that ancient American peoples never traveled or interacted over distance. Mesoamerican networks were extensive. Coastal navigation existed. The question is not whether contact is imaginable, but whether a specific claim is supported by evidence. Alien theories fail the same test more dramatically. They substitute technological disbelief for explanation. Moving basalt with human labor is difficult, but difficulty is precisely what the roots, tools, food, coordination, and political system explain. An alien machine leaves the actual social achievement unintelligible. The best response is not ridicule. It is reconstruction. Show the mountain source. Map the waterways. Estimate the labor. Explain stone tools and abrasives. Restore the rope makers and boat crews. Once human processes become visible, the supernatural shortcut becomes unnecessary. Popular media also distorts the Olmec through the phrase mysteriously vanished. The phrase promises a revelation, but it confuses several transitions. San Lorenzo lost dominance around 1000 or 900 BCE. La Venta remained important for centuries afterward. Tres Zapotes continued through the conventional end of the Olmec period. Gulf populations remained. The genuine mysteries are more specific. What languages did the inhabitants speak? What names did rulers use? What event does offering 4 represent? Does the Cascajal block encode speech? Why was a particular monument recarved? Which combination of pressures ended La Venta's dominance? These questions are compelling because evidence exists without complete answers. They do not need a vanished race. The modern label Olmec remains useful as long as we remember its limits. It groups an archaeological pattern. It does not recover one ancient self-identity. When a museum gallery labels an object Olmec, the word describes scholarly classification more securely than the personal identity of its maker. This humility changes the meaning of entire history. No documentary can provide every event between 1500 and 400 BCE. The surviving record is uneven. Elite stone is overrepresented. Women, children, laborers, and local leaders are rarely named because nobody is named. Perishable knowledge has vanished. An entire history can instead mean an honest account of the whole evidence: origins, households, environment, power, art, networks, rival interpretations, collapse, survival, and the limits of knowledge. Completeness lies in including uncertainty rather than concealing it. Return now to the colossal head from the opening. We still cannot say who he was. His portrait may represent a ruler, an ancestor, or a person holding an office whose title is lost. His headdress distinguishes him, but we cannot read its identity. We know that the basalt came from a distant volcanic landscape. We know people moved it to a political center. We know carvers transformed it with stone tools and abrasives. We know the finished face participated in public authority. Behind him stands a society. Farmers produced food beyond the needs of one household. Fishers and wetland specialists exploited rivers. Potters made vessels for kitchens, feasts, and offerings. Stoneworkers selected and shaped material. Traders connected ecological zones. Builders carried earth. Fiber workers created ropes, mats, baskets, and clothing now lost. Boat crews read currents. Ritual specialists organized sequences. Local leaders negotiated obligations. Families raised the next generation inside this system. The ruler did not create their knowledge. His power came from concentrating it. That concentration could achieve remarkable things. San Lorenzo became one of the earliest great centers of Mesoamerica. Its inhabitants reshaped a plateau and transported monumental basalt. Venta arranged architecture along a ceremonial axis and buried extraordinary wealth. Olmec images traveled across regions. Early notation and writing may have appeared in their networks. The same concentration created vulnerability. A capital dependent on many flows must keep those flows valuable. Waterways change. Exchange routes shift. Communities gain alternatives. Elites compete. Ritual claims require renewal. Environmental stress exposes unequal costs. San Lorenzo lost its central position, but La Venta rose. La Venta lost its central position, but Tres Zapotes and other communities continued. The pattern was not birth, glory, and extinction. It was concentration, redirection, and reinvention. This does not make collapse unreal. A ruler who lost his capital experienced a real fall. Specialists who lost support faced disruption. Families who moved left homes and ancestors. Ceremonial spaces became silent. Political memory was broken. But collapse belonged to institutions, not to the disappearance of human beings. The greatest Olmec monuments tried to make power permanent. Earthworks fixed order into landscape. Offerings fixed obligation beneath floors. Portraits fixed a mortal face into stone. None could prevent political change. Yet the failure of permanence became another kind of success. The monuments survived long enough to reveal the labor and imagination of their creators. Buried deposits, protected arrangements after their meanings faded. Broken inscriptions preserved the existence of voices we cannot hear. The Olmec remain important, not because they were a mysterious people from nowhere, and not because they invented everything that followed. They are important because their history captures one of humanity's earliest American experiments in large-scale political life. They show how geography becomes opportunity through knowledge. They show how exchange becomes power through concentration. They show how art transforms cooperation into authority. They show how sacred centers depend on ordinary work. And they show how people can survive the collapse of systems built to appear eternal. 3,000 years later, the stone face still looks composed. The ruler's world did not remain centered upon him. Rivers moved. Capitals changed. Languages transformed. Archaeologists arrived and gave his civilization a name borrowed from a later age. We cannot return his own name, we can return the people hidden behind his image. The final history of the Olmec is therefore not the biography of an anonymous king. It is the history of relationships that made kings possible and made their disappearance survivable. That history remains unfinished. Future excavations may discover a securely sealed text. Environmental records may clarify the timing of floods or dry periods. New surveys may reveal communities that received migrants from declining centers. Museum fragments may be reunited with monuments in the field. The next decisive discovery may come not from a colossal object, but from a seed, a soil layer, or a microscopic trace on a tool. Each discovery will have to pass the same discipline. Provenance must come before spectacle. A date must be connected to an event. A symbol must not be called a sentence without patterned evidence. A damaged monument must not be assigned an attacker without supporting traces. The strength of Olmec history lies in what multiple kinds of evidence can establish together. The sites also remain parts of contemporary landscapes. People farm near ancient mounds, travel along modern roads, and build lives in the same humid lowlands. Preservation cannot treat local communities as obstacles frozen outside history. Sustainable protection depends on their knowledge, participation, and benefit. This creates a final continuity, more concrete than any claim about a single unbroken religion. The Olmec world was built through human relationships with Gulf Coast water, soil, stone, and movement. Those landscapes are still inhabited. Their future will determine how much of the ancient past remains available. The Olmec story therefore links three responsibilities across time. Ancient communities maintained networks that made their capitals possible. Archaeologists reconstruct those networks from incomplete traces. Modern societies decide whether the traces will remain for questions not yet imagined. The anonymous ruler cannot speak for this responsibility. His monument was designed to communicate authority, not archaeological humility. Yet the survival of his face creates an encounter between his political ambition and our obligation to interpret it honestly. We do not honor the Olmec by making them supernatural. We honor them by taking their human achievement seriously. The planning, labor, disagreement, adaptation, inequality, imagination, and endurance required to construct a civilization. Water carried food, people, and stone toward the capitals. Stone made authority appear permanent. Legitimacy persuaded or compelled communities to sustain the flow. When the flow changed, the capitals fell. The face survived because it could not move. The people survived because they could.